Hey everyone, tonight we're starting our journey inside the echoing stone halls of a medieval castle. Picture this: torches sputter and flare along the walls, shadows stretching and shifting, while a thin whistle of wind slips through the cracks of the heavy wooden doors. It feels atmospheric, almost magical, the sort of place you'd find romantic if you were just passing through as a tourist. But here's the catch: if you actually had to live here, especially on a freezing winter night, the charm would wear off within the first hour. The truth is simple: castles were brutally cold. Without central heating, insulated windows, or even the comfort of a mattress that meets modern standards, your worst enemy wasn't an invading army or rival knights. It was the bitter chill. Surviving in this environment wasn't guaranteed, at least not without knowing a few clever tricks. And before we dive deeper into those, I want to pause for a moment. If you're enjoying this kind of storytelling, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the work I put into this. And since I always love connecting with you, drop a comment with your location and the local time where you're watching from. It's amazing to see just how far this community stretches across the world. Alright, now let's set the mood together. Dim the lights around you, slow down your breathing, and picture yourself settling in for the night inside a medieval stronghold. You make your way across the flagstone floor of a vast chamber, each step echoing as your boots scrape against stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Even fully dressed, the cold gnaws at your skin. The walls don't just fail to hold warmth, they seem to devour it. Historians often praise castles for their defensive genius, their towering walls and strategic designs. But comfort? That was never part of the equation. And here's the blunt reality: those massive stone walls that could shrug off a battering ram had a hidden downside. They also acted like the world's biggest refrigerator. As soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature inside dropped almost as sharply as it did outside. You'd literally see your own breath clouding in front of your face. The air turned damp, heavy, and downright unfriendly. Castles weren't built with comfort in mind. They were fortresses, designed to repel enemies, not to keep the chill at bay. The builders obsessed over moats, drawbridges, and arrow slits, but insulation? That never made it onto their plans. Here's something worth keeping in mind: many castles across northern Europe were deliberately perched on windswept hills. From a military perspective, it was genius. You had a clear line of sight on approaching enemies, and the steep slopes made any assault far more difficult. But if you were simply trying to get a decent night's rest, it was a curse. The wind howled across the stone, clawing at every crack, slipping through shutters, and sneaking under doors. Honestly, you couldn't design a worse sleeping environment if you tried. And you might be tempted to think, well, surely the fireplaces made up for it. Not quite. Even a roaring blaze in the great hall only created a small bubble of warmth, just enough for the people huddled nearby. Step away from the flames, and the chill came rushing back. By the time you trudged down the corridor to your bedchamber, the air felt more like a stone cellar than a living space. Here's a detail that always makes me pause. In some accounts from the late medieval period, travelers described the shock of finding frost inside castle bedrooms. Picture waking up to icicles dangling from your bed curtains, or glancing at your wash basin only to find the water frozen solid. That wasn't an exaggeration. That was reality for people who lived behind those towering walls. Chroniclers of the time barely bothered to comment on the cold. It was so routine that a thin layer of frost on the walls in January hardly earned more than a passing note. If your chamber didn't collect that rime of ice, you were the exception, not the rule. And yet, people endured. Somehow, they developed habits and rituals that kept their bodies from turning into human ice sculptures. Nightfall in a castle came with its own rhythm. Entire households followed well-practiced patterns designed to hold on to every scrap of warmth. Fires were carefully banked to smolder through the night, beds were enclosed with heavy curtains, and layers of clothing were piled on until moving around freely became almost impossible. Everyone went to sleep with the same silent wish, that the drafts wouldn't be too merciless before morning. Now imagine stepping into a medieval bedchamber yourself. At the center stands a large, sturdy bed, raised high above the floor. That wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was a clever tactic to avoid the coldest air, which always settles near the ground. But even elevated, you'd still feel the stone's icy breath creeping upward, seeping into your body as soon as you slid beneath the covers. Historians still debate whether castles grew any more comfortable as time went on, or if the image of cozy noble life was largely invented by later storytellers. Some argue that rich tapestries, wall hangings, and heavy draperies truly did transform drafty chambers into warmer, more livable spaces. Others insist the cold always had the upper hand, no matter how much fabric was hung on the walls. The truth probably sits somewhere in the middle. Conditions improved somewhat, but never to the point of real comfort. Life inside those walls always carried a chill. You stretch out on this imagined bed, the wooden frame groaning softly while the straw-stuffed mattress rustles beneath you. Outside, the wind presses against the battlements, moaning like a restless spirit. The only glow in the chamber comes from a small oil lamp sputtering on the bedside table, its flame fighting to stay alive in the drafts. Even fully clothed, your toes begin to sting with the sharp bite of cold. Then the night sounds of the castle drift in. You catch the echo of boots striking stone as a guard makes his rounds. Overhead, the rafters creak under the weight of frost. Somewhere below, a dog barks faintly in the courtyard, its voice muffled by the fortress walls. You might even hear the slow drip of water turning to ice in some hidden corner. None of these noises bring comfort. They only serve as reminders of how harsh and unwelcoming the outside world truly is. It's easy to picture the nobility wrapped in luxury, resting peacefully while peasants froze in their cottages. But here's the twist: sometimes the peasants had it better. Their modest homes, built of wood and daub, could actually trap the heat from a hearth far more efficiently than the cavernous chambers of a lord's keep. A single fire in a small hut might warm an entire family through the night, while a noble in a castle could lie shivering in a stone vault so vast that even 5 roaring fireplaces barely made a dent. That irony wasn't lost on people of the time. A handful of surviving letters from clerics and noble visitors complain about just how difficult it was to get proper sleep in castles during the winter. They describe the beds as magnificent in size and appearance, but the nights themselves as bitterly cold, no matter how grand the surroundings. Some medieval writers even warned travelers to bring along extra cloaks, not as a mark of fashion, but as a matter of survival. Lying there in your imagined bed, you start to realize just how much thought and resourcefulness went into something as simple as getting through the night. Sleep wasn't a matter of slipping under a blanket and drifting off. It was a process, almost a ritual. You layered fabric upon fabric, piled on animal furs, pulled heavy curtains tight, and often shared the bed with others, whether human companions or animals, anything that added body heat to the battle. Every measure was about creating small pockets of warmth, tiny microclimates, in a setting designed by both stone walls and nature to be relentlessly cold. It changes the way you think about medieval life. These people weren't just knights and nobles, monks and maidens. At their core, they were survivalists. Each bedtime became a challenge, each winter a trial, and sleep, the thing we treat as effortless, had to be engineered with rituals passed down through generations. Imagine the gratitude you'd feel for the smallest comforts: the warmth of a dog curled against your feet, the luxury of hot stones wrapped in cloth and placed near the bedding, or the tiny triumph of waking up without frost clinging to your beard. Those victories would imprint themselves on your memory far more deeply than feasts in a hall or triumphs in a hunt. Survival itself was unforgettable. And so, tonight, as you stretch out in your modern bed with central heating humming quietly in the background, spare a thought for those who once lay shivering in vast stone chambers. Their nights were long, their mornings unforgiving, but still they endured. Against all odds, They found ways to rest in places that by all rights should have been unlivable. That same spirit of ingenuity is what will keep unraveling, layer by layer, trick by trick, as this story carries you deeper into the medieval night. Picture yourself now stepping into the great hall, the true heartbeat of any castle. If the bedchamber felt like a stone tomb filled with drafts, this space at least crackles with life and flickers of warmth. Long trestle tables stretch across the floor, their wooden surfaces worn smooth and glossy from centuries of elbows, mugs, and trenchers scraping against them. The air is thick with scents: roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool steaming by the fire, and smoke that never quite clears from the rafters. At the center, the great hearth roars defiantly, a brilliant square of orange heat pushing back against the creeping fingers of winter. This was the castle's social core after nightfall. People gathered not just to eat, but to soak up every shred of warmth before retreating to their freezing quarters. Servants hurried back and forth with trenchers of bread, pitchers of ale, and steaming bowls of pottage. Dogs prowled beneath the benches, tails wagging, waiting for scraps to fall. The hall rang with noise, laughter, drinking songs, the clatter of knives and plates. For a while, you might almost forget the frost etching itself across the windows or the wind battering the battlements outside. And here's the blunt truth: the great hall was the only part of most castles where heating worked at all. A massive open hearth dominated the center, or sometimes one end, of the chamber, and through the long winters it devoured wood in staggering quantities. Whole logs, sometimes even entire tree trunks, were dragged in just to keep the flames alive. If you held rank, you claimed a place near the hearth, basking in its golden glow, while servants and the less fortunate huddled farther back, shivering on the edges of the room. But here's the catch: even in this grand space, the heat only stretched so far. The farther you sat from the blaze, the sharper the chill became, until it almost felt as if the stone walls themselves were exhaling frost. The warm air that did rise mostly drifted upward, vanishing into the smoke-blackened rafters, leaving those on the floor to wrap themselves in cloaks and lean against one another for comfort. In truth, only a select few ever felt genuinely warm. Everyone else simply put on a brave face, pretending they weren't freezing. Here's a quirky little detail chroniclers love to note: feasts sometimes doubled as heating strategies. During the most bitter months, nobles deliberately planned their largest gatherings, knowing that the body heat of hundreds of guests, combined with the roaring fire, could transform the great hall into something that almost resembled cozy. Some accounts even claim that servants were ordered to stand closer together, shoulder to shoulder, just to generate more warmth. In that sense, feasting wasn't only about celebration, it was survival disguised as merrymaking. But the glow of the hall never lasted. When the music faded and the minstrels tucked away their instruments, when guests stumbled off toward their chambers, the fire was left to burn low. The logs cracked into embers, glowing red like the last defiance against the night. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and within an hour or two, even the heart of the castle slipped back into silence, cold and unforgiving once again. Picture yourself lingering by the fire, reluctant to step away, stretching your hands toward the flames to soak up every last trace of warmth. Your cheeks burn from the heat, but the back of your body already feels the chill creeping in, a sharp reminder of what waits in the chambers above. Smoke stings your eyes, clings stubbornly to your hair and clothing, but even that irritation feels preferable to the thought of leaving. The moment you climb the spiral staircase to your bedchamber, you know the cold will reclaim you. Historians still argue over whether some castles ever developed more advanced heating systems for their great halls. A few suggest that chimneys, flues, or vents allowed warmth to circulate, particularly in later centuries. Others dismiss the idea as wishful thinking, pointing out that medieval architecture was far more concerned with strength and defense than with comfort. The consensus leans toward the harsher truth. The great hall was warm only within arm's reach of the hearth, and everywhere else the cold reigned. Even the sound of the hall reminded you of its scale and severity. Laughter didn't stay intimate, it echoed, bouncing off the stone until it felt thin and distant. Every footstep rang out too loudly, the acoustics themselves making the place feel cavernous and unwelcoming. And when the crowd dispersed, when the benches emptied and the minstrels packed away their instruments, silence rolled in like a heavy blanket. It was the kind of silence that pressed on your chest, as though you were sitting inside the belly of a slumbering giant. But perhaps the most telling moment came in the transition itself, the journey from the warmth of the great hall to the isolation of your chamber. You step away from the fire's golden glow, and into a narrow corridor lit by a lone torch. Immediately the draft finds you, a knife of icy air slicing through arrow slits and unsealed doorways. Your breath fogs again in the dim light, and the warmth you carried in your bones drains away, as though the very stones of the castle are feeding on it. That shift, from the fleeting comfort of the great hall to the endless chill beyond, defined medieval nights. Some nobles lingered so long by the fire that they nearly slept there. A high-backed bench pulled close to the hearth could double as a makeshift bed, and servants or guards often curled up near the embers rather than face the misery of their chambers. Sleeping by the fire carried its own risks: sparks, smoke, the constant shuffle of people. But compared to the stone-cold silence of the rooms above, it was a temptation many couldn't resist. Here's a curious detail from the records. Travelers often complained less about the sleep itself than about the short journey to it. That brief passage from the great hall into the freezing upper rooms was described as a shock to the body, enough to send shivers that lasted the whole night. It was as though the castle punished you for daring to think you might be comfortable, snatching away warmth the moment you stepped beyond the hearth's glow. And that glow wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Everyone knew that once the hall emptied, once the benches scraped back and the laughter faded, the night ahead would be long and merciless. The great hall wasn't just a room. It was a ritual, a last gathering of heat and company before surrendering to the cold. Each torch extinguished, each goblet drained, marked another step toward the shivering ordeal of bed. Even now, in your mind's eye, you can see how temporary it all was. The fire that once roared with life dwindles to a faint whisper, the occasional spark snapping before vanishing into the dark. A weary servant stirs the embers with a poker, half-heartedly, then lets them die. And with that, the last warmth of the castle slips away into silence. The echoes of laughter, music, and feasting fade into memory, leaving only the quiet groans of the castle as it settles into the night. Reluctantly, you turn toward the staircase, pulling your cloak tightly around your shoulders, carrying with you only the fading memory of warmth. The glow of the great hall lingers in your mind like a pleasant dream, one you wish could last longer. But already your toes are going numb, your fingers sting with the bite of cold, and you realize the rest of the night will be a constant battle for heat. That brief glow wasn't just comfort, it was survival for the spirit. The ritual of gathering, of sharing food and firelight, of pretending for a few hours that warmth still belonged to you, was what kept people sane. Without the great hall, life inside these walls would have been unendurable. With it, there was at least a momentary reprieve, a reminder of what warmth felt like before the cold reclaimed its kingdom. Now you climb higher into the keep, away from that fading warmth, and the air changes almost instantly. The fire's embrace vanishes, replaced by a damp chill that clings to your bones and seeps into your very breath. The walls close in, enormous, thicker than anything in modern homes. Sometimes 12 feet of stone separated you from the outside world. At first, that sounds like protection, a fortress against every danger. But here lies the irony. The very walls that stopped arrows, siege engines, and fire also held the cold prisoner. They didn't shield you from it, they amplified it. If you've ever stepped into a basement in the dead of winter, you already know the sensation. The stone doesn't just reflect the chill, it remembers it, radiating cold even when the air outside briefly warms. Medieval builders mastered strength, permanence, and intimidation, but comfort? That was never in their design. And so those walls became a paradox, both shield and prison at the same time. Castles stood as fortresses against men, but they were no defense at all against the weather. Historians generally agree on one thing: warmth inside a castle never spread far. A fire might roar in the hearth, smoke curling upward, but step just 10 feet away and you were practically back inside an icebox. Accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families clustered right in front of the flames, cloaks drawn tightly over their heads, while behind them servants stamped their feet just to keep circulation moving. The fire created a small bubble of bearable heat, but the stone surrounding it refused to surrender its chill. Travelers left us curious notes about this. Some complained that the very walls seemed to sweat. Moisture condensed on the frigid stone and ran down in rivulets, leaving chambers perpetually damp. Imagine lying in bed at night and hearing the steady drip of water beside you, hardly the lullaby you'd hoped for. In certain seasons, moss even crept across interior surfaces, turning noble chambers into something that resembled a cave more than a palace. And what about those rich wall hangings we picture today? Modern scholars still debate whether tapestries and draperies actually made much difference. We tend to imagine grand walls softened by thick woven cloth, but were they truly insulating or mostly decorative? Some argue the heavy fabric really did help, blocking drafts and creating small pockets of warmth behind them. Others insist that later romantic depictions exaggerated their effectiveness, pointing out that even the richest tapestry couldn't compete with icy air sneaking through unglazed windows and gaps under the doors. In the end, comfort was always a relative term. At best, these measures took the edge off. At worst, they were little more than decoration draped over stone that never stopped breathing cold. The debate about tapestries and warmth may never be fully settled, but it does reveal one truth: people were desperate enough to try anything that might help. So picture the scene now. It's late January as you step into a castle bedchamber. The fire in the hearth has dwindled, little more than a few glowing coals. The walls rise around you like cliffs, slick with condensation despite the layers of fabric draped across them. You shiver as the cold closes in. In the center of the room stands the bed, imposing and heavy, its curtains pulled tight. Inside, the air might be a fraction warmer, a fragile cocoon carved out of the surrounding chill. But outside those curtains the chamber feels like a stone tomb. The effect wasn't just physical. It was psychological. Writers of the time often described the cold as a greater burden than hunger, or even sickness. Hunger could be sated, illness might pass, but the cold was relentless, waiting for you every night of the winter season. In a castle, there was no true escape from it. That sense of being imprisoned by your own home weighed heavily on people's minds. Now imagine lying there, tugging the coverlet tight, listening to the hiss of wind slipping through arrow slits. Your ears sting, your fingers stiffen, and even in your dreams, images of fire and ice chase you. The stone walls don't wrap around you like a shield. They press them like the walls of a refrigerator that never switches off. And here's where perspective shifts. Castles weren't glamorous in day-to-day life. They were survival machines, designed to protect, yes, but always at a cost. Comfort was the sacrifice for security. Every winter night reminded you that stone could stop arrows, but it could never hold warmth. The more you reflect on it, the clearer the truth becomes. Sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't about peaceful rest. It was about waging a nightly war against the elements. The enemy was invisible but merciless, and the battlefield was always the same: your chamber, your bed, your own body. As you shuffle across the chamber floor, your boots don't strike polished wood or thick carpet. Instead, they crunch against something far more humble: rushes scattered across the stone. These weren't for decoration. They were practical, a simple attempt to soften the ground beneath your feet, soak up spills, and most importantly, provide a crude layer of insulation against the freezing stone. Records from the later Middle Ages describe how households renewed the rushes several times a year, laying them thick across noble halls and bedchambers. When fresh, they brought with them the sense of the outdoors, a faint grassy sweetness, an earthy smell that almost felt like summer carried indoors. For a brief time, the greenery added padding, muffled footsteps, and even helped trap a little warmth closer to the ground. But the charm faded quickly. As weeks passed, the rushes collected everything: food scraps, spilled ale, stray bones from the feast, even ash from the hearth. Mice and insects soon made the floor their playground. If you're picturing a rustic, natural carpet, it's time to adjust that image. By the end of winter, the rushes could be so foul that one French moralist complained the chambers were no better than middens, refuse heaps disguised as floors. What's fascinating, though, is how these rushes served double duty. They were both a form of comfort and a reminder of the constant trade-off between practicality and filth in medieval life. Yes, the rushes helped trap a thin layer of warmth, but they also had another purpose. They absorbed moisture from the perpetually damp stone floors. In a castle where condensation dripped steadily down the walls, this mattered. Without them, every step would have meant crossing slick flagstones and puddles of icy water. Household records from England include a curious detail. Herbs such as lavender, rosemary, or meadow flowers were sometimes scattered among the rushes. The idea was practical on one hand and psychological on the other. Strong-smelling plants masked the stench of rotting scraps hidden in the reeds, while at the same time offering a faint breath of comfort in rooms otherwise heavy with smoke, damp, and animal odors. Imagine crawling into bed and, through the thick scent of wet wool and wood smoke, catching the delicate trace of lavender. It wouldn't make you any warmer, but for a moment it might make the night a little more bearable. Architectural historians still debate how effective these rushes really were. Some argue they provided genuine insulation, forming a protective mat between human feet and freezing stone. Others dismiss them as more symbolic than practical, a gesture of order and cleanliness that did little against the real sources of heat loss, the vast walls and high ceilings. The truth remains uncertain, the evidence fragmentary. Were the rushes a true medieval technology of warmth, or simply a messy custom dressed up as tradition? Now picture yourself lying in bed while a servant scatters a fresh layer of rushes across the chamber floor. They crunch softly underfoot, releasing faint earthy aromas as they're pressed down. For a fleeting moment, the room feels cleaner, almost civilized. But you know what comes next. By morning, the reeds will have already begun to soak up dampness, and the cycle of decay will start all over again. Imagine the sensory overload of a medieval bedroom. Beneath your blankets, you might feel the scratchy comfort of wool or the soft weight of fur. But rising around you is a mix of scents: the musty odor of old rushes, the sharp bite of herbs scattered underfoot, and the inescapable smoke that clings stubbornly to your clothes and hair. From the floor comes the faint rustle of mice foraging for crumbs. Every detail reminds you that sleep in a castle was never about luxury, it was about survival. And yet, there's a certain ingenuity in all of it. People took the simplest materials, plants gathered from fields and riverbanks, and transformed them into tools to endure the relentless cold. They didn't think in terms of carpets, insulation, or central heating. They thought in terms of whatever could hold the chill back, even by a fraction. So as you rest your head in this imagined chamber, you realize that even the floor beneath you was part of the nightly battle against the cold. Stone was the enemy. Rushes were the fragile shield. And each morning began with the same question: how long until the damp and decay crept back in? Now you picture yourself sitting on the edge of the bed, running your fingers across the layers of cloth piled high. If there was one medieval secret weapon against the night chill, it was fabric. Wool, linen, and fur became the armor of choice, wrapped and layered until you looked less like a sleeper and more like a cocoon. Household records and inventories make this clear. Textiles weren't just decoration, they were essential to survival. Linen sheets provided the foundation, smooth, cool against the skin, though hardly insulating. The real defense came from what was layered above. Over those linen sheets came thick woolen blankets, sometimes so heavy that people compared them to the weight of a hound lying across you. And if you had the wealth, you layered on fur covers, fox, sable, even bear. Nobles poured fortunes into their bedding, not purely for display, but because without it, a winter's night could prove deadly. There's a light-hearted detail buried in the sources. Servants sometimes joked that their masters couldn't move once they were tucked in. With so many layers pinning them down, turning over required serious effort. Picture being swaddled beneath 5 or 6 heavy blankets, so tightly arranged that you either lay perfectly still or risk tugging the covers loose and freezing. Warmth came at the expense of mobility, but for most, it was a trade they gladly accepted. Fur, though, deserves special attention. Beyond its association with luxury, it was one of the most practical defenses against the cold. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins, and sheepskin provided dense, lasting warmth. One chronicler tells of a noblewoman in Burgundy who refused to travel anywhere without her ermine-lined bed covers, even in the height of summer, because she dreaded catching chills at night. To modern ears, it sounds excessive, even absurd, but in an age when icy drafts cut through every room, that kind of paranoia made perfect sense. And then there's a curious custom noted in certain households. Some people believed that sleeping under too much linen was unhealthy, because linen was thought to draw out the body's heat. To counter this, they deliberately sandwiched it, placing wool or fur above and below. The result was something we might call a medieval textile sandwich, a strange blend of superstition and practicality. The thinking went like this: linen cooled the body, wool provided heat, and fur trapped it all inside. Whether that theory holds up scientifically is doubtful, but it shows how medieval people blended folklore with practical comfort. Scholars today still puzzle over the meaning of these textiles. Were furs truly a matter of survival, or mostly a display of status? The records point both ways. On one side, we see inventories listing staggering collections of fur coverlets in noble households. On the other, poorer families managed to endure winters without them, depending instead on coarse wool. Some historians argue that furs function primarily as symbols of rank and power, while others insist they were indispensable in drafty, freezing castles. The truth likely falls somewhere in the middle. They were both life-saving tools and unmistakable badges of prestige. Now picture yourself lying beneath those layers. The wool itches faintly against your skin, rougher than anything we tolerate today. Above that, the fur presses down heavy and dense, almost smothering, but at least it seals out the chill. The sheer weight of the blankets pins you to the straw mattress. You shift slightly, but not much. Any bigger movement would risk pulling in icy drafts and undoing the fragile cocoon you've built. Your own breath becomes part of the insulation, warming the small pocket of air around your face. And in the stillness of the chamber, every sensation sharpens. The whisper of linen shifting, the coarse scratch of wool, the musky odor of animal pelts lingering in the air. It feels intimate, raw, almost primal. You are swaddled in the skins and fibers of the natural world, locked in a nightly pact with it for your survival. Every fiber, every strand of fur or fabric was a reminder that survival hinged on turning the natural world into a kind of shield. And in that simple truth, you uncover the heart of what it meant to sleep in the Middle Ages. Rest wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was about constructing a fortress within the larger fortress, not with stone walls or moats, but with blankets, furs, and woven cloth. Night after night, people piled on whatever textiles they could find, layering them as though they were barricades against the icy air. Without this protective cocoon, even the grandest chamber in the finest castle would feel less like a room and more like a tomb. So, as you imagine yourself bundled into that makeshift shelter, the nightly ritual becomes clear. Gather every layer you can, press them down over your body, and hope they hold until dawn. The chill might still rattle at the shutters, seep through cracks in the stone, and swirl around your bed, but wrapped in fabric and fur, you at least had a fighting chance. The bed itself was far more than just furniture. It functioned almost like an early climate machine, creating a pocket of warmth and life in an otherwise unwelcoming space. When you pull aside the heavy curtains of a medieval four-poster, you're not simply peering into a private sleeping area. You're entering a miniature world carefully engineered for survival. Household records from the nobility make it clear just how prized these massive beds were. Unlike the humble straw pallets peasants used, noble beds were towering constructions, often as tall as a person, hewn from solid oak or rich walnut. Their posts rose like pillars, sometimes lavishly carved, supporting the canopy above. And that canopy, while beautiful to look at, served a far more practical purpose. Draped with thick curtains, it trapped precious body heat inside, sealing in warmth against the relentless cold. That clever setup could transform a freezing chamber into something that at least resembled warmth. Think of it almost like pitching a medieval tent inside your own bedroom. Once those curtains were pulled shut, the change was striking. The heat from your body, your breath, and the thick layers of bedding all gathered together in a room where the air outside might linger just above freezing. Those few extra degrees weren't trivial. They could be the difference between enduring a miserable, sleepless night and actually managing something close to comfort. There's a well-known account of a French duchess who insisted on traveling with her entire bed dismantled and hauled along in carts. Why go to such effort? Because to her, that bed wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was essential to survival. Spending a night in an unfamiliar abbey or drafty castle without her familiar canopy and curtains would have meant hours of shivering in the dark. English records add an intriguing detail. Sometimes the curtains themselves were treated with wax or lined with oiled cloth to stop the drafts even more effectively. Picture yourself drawing those heavy drapes closed, the fabric weighted, carrying the faint scent of beeswax or resin. They didn't simply block out the cold. They created darkness, softened noise, and gave the impression of privacy in rooms where privacy was nearly impossible. Even today, scholars debate just how effective these grand beds really were. Did they truly keep sleepers warmer, or have later storytellers exaggerated their usefulness? Archaeological evidence leans toward the practical view. The surviving fragments suggest the curtains were indeed thick, sometimes layered. So it seems likely they did their job. Yet others argue that the sense of protection might have been as important as the actual heat. Perhaps the real comfort came from the psychological warmth, the feeling of being enclosed, shielded, hidden away from the vast, echoing cold beyond the fabric walls. The arguments about their true effectiveness may go on, but one fact is undeniable. People of the time valued these beds so highly that portable versions became essential for the nobility. Now, imagine yourself climbing into one of them. The frame groans faintly under your weight. The straw mattress gives a quiet rustle, and then your hand reaches out to draw the curtain shut. In an instant, the atmosphere changes. The air is still chilly, yes, but no longer pierced by the icy drafts sneaking in through arrow slits. Your breath no longer clouds so quickly, your muscles ease beneath the weight of layered blankets, and for the first time, sleep feels possible. The curtain softens the world outside. The faint drip of water trickling down cold stone walls, the muffled cough of a servant passing in the hallway, even the distant bark of a dog, all fade into the background. Inside, the space carries its own scent, cloth, fur, and a faint musk that somehow feels reassuring. The only sound is the gentle shuffle of your bedding when you shift. Beyond those curtains, the chamber may remain cavernous and unwelcoming, but here in your bed, you've managed to carve out a fragile bubble of life against the elements. Of course, the system wasn't flawless. On some nights, moisture condensed on the fabric and froze it stiff, turning the curtain into a sheet of ice. On others, smoke from the hearth drifted inside and startled you awake, choking in the haze. Yet despite these flaws, for nobles of the era, the four-poster canopy bed stood as the best available defense against the nightly siege of cold. And it's here that the real ingenuity of medieval life reveals itself. Their brilliance wasn't always found in monumental inventions, but in practical, clever adjustments to harsh realities. No central heating? Then create a personal bubble of warmth. No insulation? Hang heavy curtains and trap what little heat you can. Every night was a quiet battle with the cold, and the canopy bed became the closest thing to a negotiated peace. Picture yourself lying there now, eyelids heavy, the world outside your curtains slipping into quiet. The chamber remains cold, the castle walls still leaching drafts, but within this small cocoon you've created, survival suddenly feels possible. Sleep comes not because the night has grown warmer, but because, with nothing more than fabric and wood, you've managed to outsmart the chill, at least enough to rest. Still, beneath all those blankets and curtains, the true foundation of your night's comfort lay in the mattress itself. What you slept on could determine everything, whether you awoke sore, frozen, and irritable, or managed to pass the night in relative comfort. In the Middle Ages, bedding came in many forms, but two stood above the rest: the feather bed and the straw tick. The feather bed was the undisputed luxury. Imagine sinking down into a sack stuffed to bursting with goose or duck feathers, soft and yielding, wrapping your body in warmth. Estate inventories from noble households often list feather beds among their most precious possessions, carefully stored and packed whenever the lord and his family traveled. A well-stuffed one could be so thick it lifted you nearly a foot above the bed frame, creating a buoyant cushion in an otherwise unforgiving chamber. Families treasured them, guarded them jealously, and handed them down across generations. They weren't only about comfort, they were a mark of wealth and prestige. But luxury came with a catch. Those feather beds could trap so much heat that sleepers sometimes found themselves suffocatingly hot, waking drenched in sweat, even in the dead of winter. One amusing complaint survives in a 15th century letter, where a weary guest grumbled that his host's feather mattress swallowed him whole. Like a goose in a pot. Too many feathers could actually spoil the experience. Instead of floating gently on a cushion of softness, you might sink so deep into the mattress that you spend half the night fighting your way back to the surface. For most people, though, feather beds were out of reach. The everyday reality was the straw tick, a large sack crammed with straw, hay, or reeds, packed tight enough to form a makeshift mattress. These rough beds were everywhere. Peasants relied on them, soldiers slept on them, and even castles stocked their lesser chambers with them. They were cheap, easy to refill, and at least managed to keep you off the freezing floor. But straw came with its own set of problems. It flattened quickly, jabbed through the cloth to prick your skin, and often became a haven for fleas. Families had to beat the mattress regularly, shaking and striking it to fluff the straw back up and chase out the vermin. By morning, your body might itch from scratches and bites, but the important part was that you made it through the night. Medieval records even note an interesting custom. Some households mixed herbs into the straw, both to freshen the smell and to drive away pests. A handful of lavender, sprigs of mint, or pennyroyal might be scattered inside, leaving behind a faint fragrance that tried to disguise the sour, musty odor of damp hay. And if you've ever been near a straw-stuffed bed, you'll know, the earthy smell never really fades. It seeps into your clothes, your skin, even your hair. As for feather beds, historians are still divided over how common they truly were. Some insist they remained rare luxuries reserved only for the wealthiest elite. Others point to estate records that show even middling households boasting at least one feather mattress, hinting that they may have been more widespread than once assumed. The debate lingers because the historical evidence is scattered, yet even those fragments reveal something important. People cared about their sleeping surfaces so much that they were carefully listed in records and inventories. Now, imagine yourself settling onto a straw tick in a drafty chamber. The sack crinkles beneath you, uneven clumps pressing uncomfortably into your back. Each small movement stirs up a faint grassy smell, mingled with the sharper notes of dried herbs. From somewhere in the rushes on the floor, you catch the quick, nervous scurry of mice, and can't help but wonder if they'll venture closer before morning. The blankets weigh down over you, but the scratchy, shifting straw beneath is a constant reminder that comfort, in this world, was never promised. Now shift the scene. Picture yourself in a noble's chamber, lowering into a feather bed. At first, you sink into its softness, your body gently enveloped by the down. The sensation borders on heavenly, until the heat builds. The feathers settle and you find yourself rolling into a hollow that clutches you too tightly. You shove at the heavy blankets in search of a cooler breath of air, but the curtains hold everything in. And still, even as you drift back into uneasy sleep, you know this small discomfort is worlds better than the scratch of straw. The contrast between straw and feathers reflected more than comfort. It mirrored the structure of medieval society itself. To sleep on feathers marked privilege, wealth, and status. To sleep on straw meant necessity, survival at its barest. Yet in both cases, whether wrapped in luxury or lying on the simplest tick, the goal was the same: to keep the human body alive against the cold breath of stone chambers. And so, as you imagine yourself drifting off in one of these beds tonight, you recognize a truth about medieval sleep. People weren't passive victims of their environment. Each mattress, whether a humble sack of straw or a prized cushion of feathers, was the product of effort, adaptation, and a small but hard-won victory over the relentless cold. In the Middle Ages, going to bed wasn't a mindless collapse into sleep, it was a deliberate, strategic act. You had to decide, sink into the luxury of feathers if you had them, or make do with straw, all with the single aim of making it through the night alive. And yet, even the most carefully crafted bed, canopy drawn, mattresses layered, blankets piled high, wasn't always enough on its own. When the air turned truly bitter, the real deciding factor wasn't furniture at all. It was company. To lie alone in a stone chamber meant that your body heat simply drained into the cold walls. But to lie beside others meant warmth was multiplied, bodies acting like crude radiators in the dark. Noble families knew this, though it was rarely spoken aloud. Servants often slept in adjoining chambers, or on pallets at the very foot of the master's bed. That arrangement wasn't purely about duty or protection, it was practical. More bodies in a room meant more warmth, even if only by a few desperately needed degrees. You might not notice it when you first drifted off. But by midnight, when frost crept onto the inside of the shutters, every extra body made a difference. The same principle shows up in monastic life. Records from medieval monasteries describe dormitories where monks slept in long rows, their cots or straw ticks lined up side by side. On the surface, this looks like a matter of discipline and shared routine. But it was also about survival. In those packed quarters, collective body heat formed a fragile shield against the cold. Soldiers, too, knew the value of proximity. In barracks, men huddled shoulder to shoulder, cloaks pulled tight, trusting that together they could endure what no man could withstand alone. Warmth in these places wasn't simply comfort, it was strategy, a quiet pact of endurance in the face of the cold. One fascinating story comes from a 14th-century English manor. In his will, a nobleman made a very specific request, that his favored squire be given the right to sleep near his lord's chamber fire. Scholars see this not only as a sign of affection, but also as proof that warmth itself was as valuable a gift as land or money. To be invited into someone's chamber, or even their bed, wasn't just a gesture of intimacy. It was a privilege, a literal share in survival. But humans weren't the only source of nighttime heat. Animals played their part too. Dogs especially became living heaters. The phrase, a three-dog night, may have roots in later folklore, but the concept rings true in the medieval world. People often welcomed hounds into their beds, not simply for companionship, but because their bodies radiated precious warmth. A pair of mastiffs curled at your feet could mean the difference between numb, aching toes and actual comfort. Travelers even wrote about inns where guests slept crowded together with dogs, goats, and sometimes even sheep. The smell may have been overwhelming, but warmth mattered more than fragrance. Among the nobility, the question of bed sharing is still debated. Some historians believe it was relatively routine: lords sleeping beside trusted companions, ladies with their maids, or travelers pressed in beside strangers. Others argue that for the elite, such intimacy was carefully controlled, with servants kept to nearby pallets rather than the bed itself. What is clear, however, is that among common folk, bed-sharing was a way of life. Families piled in together, parents, children, and grandparents, all tangled beneath the same heap of blankets. Privacy was a luxury few cared about when survival was at stake. Now imagine yourself lying in such a bed, not alone, but shoulder to shoulder with others. At first, it's awkward. Elbows jab, someone coughs, a blanket slips. But before long the warmth builds. Bodies press close, breath mingles, and the air inside the shared cocoon grows almost cozy. You feel the reassuring weight of a dog at your feet, hear the steady breathing of companions all around, and slowly your muscles let go of their tension. The wind may scream through the castle walls, but here, in this knot of people and animals, comfort feels within reach. Of course, there were drawbacks. Fleas and lice spread easily in such conditions, and whispers in the dark could carry secrets that were never meant to be shared. Yet, when the choice was between irritation and freezing, most people chose warmth every time. Companionship trumped solitude. Survival mattered more than dignity. To us today, the thought of crawling into bed with siblings, servants, or even livestock might feel deeply uncomfortable. But for the medieval sleeper, this wasn't strange at all. It was common sense, a survival tactic passed down through generations. In a world built of stone and shadowed by frost, every extra body was a blessing. So tonight, as you tuck your own blanket more tightly around yourself, remember those long-ago sleepers who faced the same cold with far fewer defenses. Their solution was simple: share what warmth you had and pray the night would be kind. And as you blow out your candle and sink beneath the covers in this imagined chamber, you realize, it isn't only the blankets or the curtains that keep you alive tonight. It's also what you're wearing. Unlike us, slipping into pajamas, or nothing at all, medieval people often went to bed wrapped nearly as warmly as they were during the day. Clothing itself became part of the insulation system, an extension of the bed. Household records and surviving garments tell us that the standard bedtime attire was the nightshirt, a long, loose linen garment that looked like an oversized tunic. Linen may not sound especially warm to modern ears, but it was the practical choice, far easier to wash than wool, smoother against the skin, and breathable enough to prevent suffocation under heavy covers. When the air grew bitterly cold, people simply added more layers, pulling on an extra wool tunic, or even draping a cloak over themselves. For the medieval sleeper, the rule was simple: the more fabric, the better. One detail, though, stands out above the rest: the nightcap, often called a coif. These were small cloth caps, sometimes tied beneath the chin, sometimes just pulled snugly over the head. Why such emphasis on covering the skull? Because it was widely believed, quite sensibly, that much of a person's body heat escaped through the head. To go to bed without a coif was, in their minds, like a knight marching into battle without armor, recklessly unprotected. Medieval manuscripts even depict sleepers tucked neatly into bed, their heads carefully wrapped, looking almost as if they were prepared for a journey rather than a night's rest. The nightshirt itself varied depending on wealth and circumstance. Poorer families often repurposed their everyday undertunic for sleeping, while nobles commissioned nightwear of fine linen, embroidered with colored threads or even edged in fur. Some ladies owned elaborate sleeping hoods with trailing ribbons, though one suspects those were more for display than for practical use. Whatever the style, the principle remained constant: cover every part of the body you reasonably could. One curious recommendation from a 15th century medical text even advised binding the feet in linen or wool at night, as protection against the creeping chill of the nighttime air. To the medieval mind, clothing wasn't just fashion, it was survival gear, even in sleep. This wasn't about fashion, it was simple survival. People understood that the body's extremities froze first, so they wrapped toes, ankles, and even hands in strips of cloth before bed, creating makeshift socks and mittens. You can almost feel it, your hands swaddled, your feet cocooned, every patch of exposed skin carefully hidden from the merciless cold. But here, too, historians argue over the details. Some believe that specialized sleepwear was common, at least for wealthier households, while peasants simply collapsed in the very garments they had worn all day. Others point to wills and household inventories that list night linen specifically, suggesting that by the late Middle Ages, separate clothing for sleep had become the norm for the middle and upper ranks. The truth likely varied depending on class and region, but all evidence points to one certainty. Whatever form it took, covering up at night was non-negotiable. Now imagine preparing for bed this way. You peel off your heavier outer garments, pull on a long linen shirt, and tug a snug cap down over your ears. The cold air immediately bites at your neck until you burrow beneath the blankets. Layer by layer, each strip of cloth becomes a barrier, and together they form your cocoon. The bed may still be drafty, the room may still feel like an icebox, but your body has turned into its own fortress of fabric. The sensations are vivid. At first, the linen feels cool against your skin, faintly scratchy, but soon it warms with your own body heat. The wool smells faintly of sheep and lanolin, earthy but comforting. The cap presses gently against your head, muffling sound and making you feel enclosed, almost sealed away. You wriggle into position, swaddled like a parcel, and lie there waiting for sleep to arrive. But warmth wasn't the only reason for night clothes. Modesty played just as important a role. In a world where sharing beds was common, between family members, companions, or even strangers, slipping under the covers half-dressed or naked was socially unacceptable. Even married couples are shown in manuscripts wearing their nightcaps and long shirts to bed. Sleep wasn't only about getting through the night, it was also about maintaining propriety. So whether you were a lord or lady, a servant or a soldier, your nightshirt and cap weren't just practical. They carried a social function, too. Imagine the rhythm of those evenings, not undressing, as we might think of it, but layering more cloth. Tying knots, smoothing wrinkles, pulling fabric into place, preparing not for relaxation but for defense. In the modern world, pajamas suggest comfort and ease. For the medieval sleeper, nightwear was closer to armor, another line of protection against the siege of cold. So tonight, as you tug your own blanket higher, picture those long-ago figures settling into bed. They looked less like dreamers and more like travelers, bundled in linen and wool, their heads tightly wrapped. Sleep did not come naturally. It was engineered, stitch by stitch, layer by layer, against the unrelenting chill of stone walls. And just before you slip under the covers in this imagined chamber, another ritual unfolds. A servant steps forward, carrying a long-handled pan, its brass surface glowing faintly in the firelight. Inside, hot coals crackle and hiss, releasing the sharp scent of ash and heated metal. This was the medieval warming pan, a tool as simple as it was ingenious. After all, who would want to crawl into sheets that felt like slabs of ice? The process went like this. The servant would take the pan and glide it back and forth between the bedclothes, the hot coals inside radiating warmth through tiny holes in the brass. As it moved, the sheets puffed with little wisps of smoke, and the room filled with the sharp tang of burning wood. For a few minutes, the bed changed from a slab of ice into something almost welcoming. Without this ritual, you might spend an hour shivering in place before your body heat managed to soften the chill on its own. Surviving household inventories list warming pans right alongside candlesticks and chamber pots, everyday tools of nightly life. They weren't rare luxuries, they were expected. By the later Middle Ages, wealthy homes across Europe considered them standard equipment for winter nights. A chamber without one signaled neglect, or that the person sleeping there ranked too low in status to deserve the comfort. But warming pans came with dangers. Letters and household records complain of linens scorched black, or worse, igniting when a careless servant left the pan in one spot too long. Imagine sliding into bed, only to find a smoldering hole in your sheets. There are half-comic, half-tragic tales of noblemen leaping from bed in the middle of the night as sparks set blankets alight in chambers roofed with dry, flammable rushes. In such settings, one careless ember could become a catastrophe. Some accounts even describe unusual practices. An Italian source tells of sprinkling aromatic herbs directly onto the glowing coals before warming the bed. The smoke left behind was thought not only to scent the sheets but also to cleanse the air and guard against illness. You can almost smell it now, sharp, herbal, and smoky, a mingling of comfort and superstition curling through the chamber. Lavender and rosemary mixed with the sharp bite of ember smoke, their scents clinging faintly to the fabric as you finally slip beneath it. In that moment, practicality and superstition blended into a single ritual, a nightly fight not just against the cold, but against unseen illnesses believed to lurk in the air. Even now, scholars debate just how common warming pans truly were. Some argue they belonged mainly to the wealthy, too costly and too dangerous for ordinary households. Others counter that humbler versions existed, clay pots packed with embers, wrapped in cloth, and tucked under the sheets. These simpler tools rarely survive the centuries, which makes the evidence frustratingly elusive. But one thing is clear, across the social ladder, people found some way to chase the chill from their beds before lying down. Now picture yourself in that drafty chamber, watching the ritual unfold. The servant glides the pan carefully across the sheets, the heat driving off faint wisps of steam as the dampness evaporates. When the pan is finally withdrawn, you slip under the covers and are met by a surprising rush of warmth, startling in its contrast to the icy air around you. You hurry to seal it in, clutching the blankets tight, as though trying to trap a fleeting miracle. For a few blissful minutes, it feels like you've stolen a scrap of summer and smuggled it into the heart of winter. But the illusion fades quickly. The heat drains away, claimed once again by the stone walls and bitter drafts. The trick was never meant to last the whole night. Its purpose was simpler, just enough warmth to make those first minutes bearable, long enough for sleep to take hold before the cold returned. Once your body loosened, once fatigue finally outweighed the shivering, sleep was more likely to come. At that point, your own body heat could take over, doing the work the fire and the blankets could not. In that sense, the warming pan was a symbol of compromise. It never truly conquered the cold, but it gave you just enough of an advantage to start. It was like striking a quiet bargain with the night itself. Grant me a few minutes of comfort, and I will endure the rest. As you picture yourself lying there, drifting off with the faint scent of embers still lingering on the sheets, you begin to realize how ritualized medieval sleep really was. Each evening unfolded as a carefully rehearsed sequence. Clothing layered, caps tied, curtains drawn, pans of coals passed back and forth. The warming pan wasn't a trinket for display. It was part of a survival kit, and without it, countless nights would have begun not in rest, but in misery. You stir in your imagined bed, tugging the heavy blankets closer. Suddenly, you feel a weight settle against your legs, a warm, solid shape curling into the bend of your knees. It sighs contentedly and makes itself comfortable for the night. This time, it isn't another person. It's a dog, or perhaps two, maybe even three, if fortune favored you. The practice of letting animals into bed was anything but unusual. Dogs in particular were far more than hunters or guardians. They were living heaters. Their thick coats radiated precious warmth, and their loyalty kept them close to their masters through the long hours of darkness. In a castle chamber that might otherwise feel like a stone cave filled with ice, a few hounds nestled at your feet could make the night not only tolerable, but almost comforting. Wills and household accounts from the later Middle Ages occasionally mentioned small lap dogs bequeathed to noblewomen, not simply as tokens of affection, but as nighttime companions. These little comfort dogs, as we might call them today, were pampered and perfumed, brushed to a shine, yet their most vital role came at night, keeping their mistresses warm. Larger breeds, on the other hand, sprawled across the foot of the bed like furry bolsters, shielding toes from frostbite with their sheer bulk. One curious detail comes from Scandinavia, where travelers in winter inns sometimes requested to sleep in the stalls with animals rather than in the unheated guest rooms. Horses, cattle, and sheep gave off so much body heat that sharing their space was far warmer than facing a stone bedchamber alone. Picture yourself dozing to the slow, steady breath of a cow at your side. The air is thick with the scent of hay and animal musk, not glamorous, perhaps, but astonishingly effective. Dogs, however, carried a deeper intimacy. A French proverb from the Middle Ages claimed that a faithful dog keeps the frost from his master's heart. The meaning was both literal and poetic. The animal's warmth preserved the body, while its loyal presence softened the loneliness of long, drafty nights. Scholars still debate how universal this practice truly was. Some argue that noble households frowned on the idea of sharing a bed with animals, treating it as a private indulgence rather than an acceptable custom. Others point to scattered references that suggest it was far more widespread, especially in rural estates or frontier castles, where survival and comfort often outweighed etiquette. The debate continues. Was the image of a noble lady sleeping with her lapdog merely a romantic flourish, or a reflection of everyday practicality? To get closer to the truth, imagine the scene for yourself. You're swaddled in your linen nightshirt, cocooned under heavy wool blankets, the curtains of the bed pulled snug against the drafts. Outside, the wind shrieks along the battlements like a living thing. Your toes sting with cold, until suddenly, a hound nestles against them. Its fur is coarse, its body sturdy and warm, carrying with it the scent of the hunt and the outdoors. Yet in that moment you welcome it without hesitation. Another dog curls against your side, and soon you're enveloped not just in fabric, but in living heat. The chamber beyond remains icy, but within your bed the world feels transformed. Of course, this comfort came with its share of inconveniences. Dogs shed hair across the sheets, tracked in mud or worse, and sometimes smuggled gnawed bones into the bedclothes. Fleas and other pests traveled freely between hound and human, making their presence well known. Yet the trade-off was clear: better fleas than frostbite, better a soiled blanket than an endless night of shivering. The sensory mix of such a night was unforgettable. The musky, earthy smell of dog fur, the faint smoke clinging to your garments, the heavy press of blankets above, and beneath it all the steady rhythm of another creature's breathing. Small wonder that people spoke of their animals with a fondness that bordered on reverence. To share warmth was to share survival. The later phrase, a three-dog night, captures this reality perfectly, even if it was coined centuries after the fact. One dog meant a tolerable chill. 2 signaled bitter cold. And 3? That was a night when winter showed its full strength. 3 dogs in the bed meant the night was bitter beyond measure, a cold so merciless that even nobles piled every possible source of warmth into their canopied retreats. So as you lie in your own bed tonight, think of how extraordinary it must have felt for those in stone fortresses, surrounded by drafts and swallowed by darkness, to find comfort in something as simple and steadfast as a loyal animal curled at their side. In that quiet exchange of heat, human and dog carried each other through countless winter nights. But now, pull back the curtains of that noble bed in your imagination and step out across the courtyard. In the shadowed servants' quarters, another world of sleep unfolds, one far humbler, yet often more efficient. The contrast between peasant and noble slumber was stark, but the goal was the same: survival through the long, bitter hours. And the question lingers: who truly slept warmer? The answer may surprise you. Nobles certainly had the grandeur: 4 posters piled with feather beds, for coverlets, warming pans, and curtains heavy enough to rival tapestries. Yet grandeur did not guarantee comfort. Their chambers were vast, designed for display as much as rest, and their size made them nearly impossible to heat. Even with the fireplace roaring, the stone walls devoured warmth like a sponge, leaving the air so cold that a lord might lie on heaps of down and fur while still watching his breath mist in the dark. By contrast, peasants slept in modest timber houses, walled with wattle and daub, small enough that a single hearth could warm the entire interior. A thick thatched roof acted as insulation, trapping precious heat inside. Families slept close together, often with livestock stabled at the far end of the room. Between the flickering fire, the animals' body heat, and the press of human company, the air inside these cottages was often far more tolerable than the cavernous chill of a noble keep. A traveler visiting a 14th-century English village remarked with mild surprise that, though the peasants' huts were crude and small, they actually held warmth far better than the lofty stone tower of the lord. Yet warmth was not the only measure of status. Nobles, even if their chambers were colder, had access to far finer materials, soft, well-woven wool, imported furs, and linen that grew supple after repeated washings. Peasants, meanwhile, made do with rough cloth, coarse wool blankets patched and repatched until they grew thin, or sheepskins cured hastily in smoky sheds. Their bedding worked, insulating well enough, but it carried strong smells of lanolin and hearth smoke and never gave the sense of luxury. Memorial records add curious details. In some households, peasants and their children slept directly on benches close to the fire, little ones curled in their parents' laps. The risk of sparks and smoke was real, but the guarantee of warmth outweighed the danger. Nobles, by contrast, often slept in chambers removed from the central hall, separated from the blaze of the great hearth. Their isolation gave them privacy, but it also meant their beds stood further from the very source of heat. Comfort, then, was unevenly distributed, and not always in ways you might expect. Modern researchers still wrestle with the question of the hierarchy of warmth. Did wealth truly purchase better sleep, with mountains of fur and feather tipping the balance? Or did peasants, in their cramped but snug cottages, endure the winter nights more easily than lords surrounded by grandeur and stone? Evidence points in both directions. Some scholars argue that the sheer mass of noble textiles, thick coverlets, layered sheets, endless curtains, kept them warmer overall. Others insist that the smaller, communal homes of the poor, heated by close company and a single fire, created a more practical comfort that no canopy bed could replicate. The debate remains unresolved, but the very fact of it shows how much sleep itself mirrored the social divisions of the age, status, wealth, and class shaping even the way people closed their eyes against the cold. Picture the two scenes side by side. In a castle chamber, a nobleman shifts restlessly beneath piles of blankets and fur, his breath curling white in the frigid air, every gust of wind rattling the shutters and echoing through the vast, empty room. Meanwhile, down in the village, a peasant family crowds together on a straw mattress beside the hearth. Children curl like kittens against their parents, while the faint smell of livestock drifts from the stall at the far end of the cottage. One bed is ornate, stately, and stiff with formality. The other is cramped, smoky, and earthy. But which sleeper wakes warmer? The question lingers, and the answer may never be the same for everyone. What both groups shared, however, was adaptation. Medieval sleep was less about true comfort and more about survival. Nobles flaunted their luxury, peasants leaned on closeness and simplicity, yet both sought ways to make the long nights bearable. They reshaped their habits and their homes, layering, huddling, and inventing small tricks until rest was finally possible. Beneath it all, they slept under the same stars, dreaming their way through the cold until morning returned. As you drift into your own warm bed tonight, the irony comes into focus. Status determined the trappings of sleep, but not always its quality. Sometimes the humblest hut contained more warmth, more genuine comfort, than the grandest noble hall. And yet another truth emerges. We imagine noble beds as immovable monuments, great frames of carved oak or walnut, crowned with canopies and draped in heavy curtains. But in reality, sleeping spaces shifted with the seasons. Families moved where they slept, chasing sunlight, avoiding drafts, and drawing closer to or farther from the fire. Bedrooms in the Middle Ages weren't fixed sanctuaries. They were flexible, practical spaces, chosen not for permanence, but for survival. In other words, medieval families chased the sun in winter and fled from it in summer. Records from noble estates make this habit clear. Many castles had designated winter chambers and summer chambers, not for novelty or variety, but because the physics of warmth demanded it. In the bleak months, families shifted into south-facing rooms where the weak sun streamed through the windows for a few precious hours each day. Those walls absorbed just enough heat to soften the edge of the cold, making the air feel a little less hostile, and mornings a little less brutal. When summer arrived, the rhythm reversed. Sunlit spaces were abandoned, and people moved into darker, north-facing chambers, where the heavy stone held a cooling shade. The practice was no small effort. Accounts from Edward Ivy's household describe entire beds and furnishings uprooted and relocated with the seasons. Servants hauled feather mattresses, linens, and rich tapestries from one chamber to the next, transforming bare rooms into temporary nests wherever the king chose to rest. It was a logistical ordeal, but for those living inside vast stone palaces, mobility was essential to endurance. One revealing letter from a Burgundian courtier complains that he had to lose his chamber to frost one winter. The walls, he wrote, grew so cold and damp that he refused to sleep there at all, retreating instead to a smaller room facing the rising sun. His phrasing is striking, reminding us that in castles the architecture itself could become an adversary. Rooms were conquered by cold, abandoned, and reclaimed again with the shifting seasons. Even now, archaeologists and architectural historians debate how widespread this practice truly was. Did every castle offer multiple seasonal chambers? Or was this a privilege reserved for the grandest estates, where the wealth of space allowed for such movement? Some scholars argue that most castles had only a handful of rooms fit for sleeping, forcing their residents to endure the cold wherever they were. Others counter that the layout of windows, fireplaces, and written records suggest castles were deliberately designed for seasonal living. The debate continues, but the image remains compelling, a noble household migrating within its own stone walls, much like birds shifting their nests as the weather changed. Now picture yourself caught in that yearly rhythm. As autumn deepens, your eyes drift toward the sunlit side of the keep, knowing that soon the long nights will demand every scrap of warmth. Servants dismantle your bed, hauling the frame, mattress, and heavy curtains piece by piece into a brighter chamber. The thud of carpenters setting posts rings out, while tapestries are hammered against the walls to stifle the drafts. By the time the first frost bites, your bed is ready, tucked into a space where at least the morning sun sends thin shafts of light to greet you. The sensory details sharpen the scene. You wake to that pale glow filtering through wooden shutters, to the faint smell of wool curtains newly rehung, to the sound of servants sweeping rushes across the floor of your relocated chamber. The move doesn't banish the cold, it never could. But it manages it, shifting life from unbearable to survivable. Peasants, too, adapted with the seasons, though in less formal ways. In winter, families gathered close to the hearth, their sleeping spaces clustered in the single warmest room. When summer arrived, they retreated upward to lofts or outward to barns, chasing cooler air wherever it could be found. In both castles and cottages, sleep was never fixed. It was mobile, shaped more by the elements than by any notion of interior design. What we call a bedroom today simply didn't exist in the same sense. For medieval people, a chamber wasn't a permanent sanctuary but a temporary camp within the larger fortress of stone. Beds shifted, rooms rotated, and daily life followed the rhythm of the seasons. The castle itself seemed to breathe and change, reshaped by sunlight, shadow, and temperature, as its inhabitants moved within its walls like nomads in search of tolerable shelter. And here lies another truth of medieval sleep. It was dynamic, not static. The fight against the cold demanded constant motion, planning, and adjustment. You didn't always sleep where you wished. You slept where the sun allowed, where the wind did not intrude, where the damp could be kept at bay. And as the earth turned each year, the cycle began again. Now step with me to the narrow window of a medieval chamber. Feel the icy draft slipping across your skin. Unlike our homes today, with their sealed frames and glass panes, a castle's windows were fragile openings, defenses against arrows, yes, but invitations to the wind. Without glazing, without insulation, without so much as a thin layer of protection, these apertures were little more than covered holes in the wall. Shutters or stretched cloth might keep out rain or stray birds, but they offered little defense against the cold. Household records confirm just how rare glass was. In many castles, it appeared only in chapels or the lord's private oratory, treated as a luxury too precious for ordinary chambers. For everyone else, windows meant wood, thick planks barred from within, creaking against the endless push of weather. In summer, shutters were thrown wide for light and air, but in winter they were pulled tight, groaning as the wind pressed against them. Wood alone, however, was no true barrier. Cold slipped through cracks, and dampness seeped in until walls wept with moisture. A practical answer was to stretch cloth across the opening, often linen treated with oil or wax so that it became translucent and resistant to rain. By day, such coverings emitted a dim amber light, soft and hazy, like sunshine filtering through parchment. By night they dulled the shriek of the wind, though they never silenced it entirely. The fabric flapped, the shutters rattled, and sleepers learned to live with the constant reminder that even a fortress was porous. One especially curious solution appears in a 13th century French account: horn windows. Thin slices of animal horn were scraped until they grew translucent, then fitted into wooden frames. These crude panes let in pale light and held out weather more effectively than cloth, though they yellowed quickly and warped with age. Imagine gazing out through them, the world beyond blurred and distorted, as though seen through fogged glass. Yet within the chamber, the air felt just a little less merciless. Archaeologists and historians still debate how common such horn or oiled cloth windows truly were. Some argue they were rare luxuries, confined to the wealthiest castles, while the majority of households relied solely on wooden shutters. Others suggest that by the later Middle Ages, they were more widespread across northern Europe than once believed. The evidence remains fragmentary, but the very persistence of this debate reveals how urgent the problem was. People would experiment with anything, cloth, horn, wood, in their attempt to carve a barrier between their fragile bodies and the unrelenting cold. Now imagine yourself standing at such a window. The shutter is closed, cloth stretched tight across the frame, yet already a line of frost has crept along the sill. As you lean near it, your breath clouds in the air. Outside, the snow catches the moonlight, casting the courtyard in silver. Inside, you hear the faint rattle of wood and the low moan of wind searching for any crack to slip through. No matter how carefully you've drawn your bed curtains, you know the draft will find you. The soundscape is eerie. Shutters slam in a distant corridor. Cloth coverings snap faintly, like sails tugged by invisible hands. Servants mutter as they kneel at the edges of frames, stuffing rags into the gaps. Some households even packed moss or clay into cracks as makeshift insulation. It was messy, temporary, and unsightly, but when the temperature plunged, anything was better than nothing. Peasants in cottages fought the same battle. Many of their homes had no real windows at all, only wooden shutters closing off narrow slits. Some families stretched thin animal bladders across openings to admit a trace of light. The effect was uncanny. Rooms glowed faintly, but shadows blurred and warped, as if the outside world lay behind a veil. By night, even these coverings froze solid, turning into fragile, translucent sheets of ice. For nobles, the irony was cruel. Their towers offered status and defense, but those high rooms also caught the sharpest winds. Visitors sometimes joked, or complained, that the higher they slept, the colder they felt. A peasant in his low, smoky hut might envy a lord's wealth, but never the draft whistling through a tower chamber window. And yet, even in such discomfort, there was beauty. Picture yourself lying in bed on a clear winter's night, watching the moonlight spill through the cracks, silvering the frost, and painting the stone chamber with its pale glow. The shutters cracked just enough to let a spill of silver light drift across the floor. The cold seeped in with it, yet there was a kind of poetry in the shadows. Branches outside cast shifting silhouettes against the curtains, while the snow beyond glowed faintly, reflecting the moon. Medieval sleep always teetered between discomfort and wonder, nights of aching cold interrupted by moments of fragile beauty. So tonight, when you draw your own curtains, picture those ancient windows. They weren't so much barriers as reminders that no matter how thick the walls, the night always found its way in. Sleep wasn't about conquering the cold. It was about enduring it, draft after draft, until the light of morning returned. Now imagine turning from that window toward the hearth of a castle chamber, expecting salvation in the blaze. Surely fire in a stone room must mean warmth. But the reality was far less comforting. Medieval fireplaces were vast, with chimneys yawning wide enough to swallow entire tree trunks. They made for impressive spectacle, flames roaring, sparks flying, logs collapsing into beds of glowing embers. Yet the physics worked against you. The broader the chimney, the more heat vanished straight up into the night with the smoke. Step just a few paces from the fire, and your breath still curled white in the air. The blaze created a small oasis of heat in its immediate circle, but beyond that glow, the chamber remained as bitter as ever. And fueling such a hunger took staggering amounts of wood. Household accounts note that a single winter week in a large castle could devour wagon loads of timber. Trees reduced to ash simply to keep a small patch of stone habitable. Managing forests became a constant burden, not just for building timber but for firewood. One French lord even complained in his letters that heating his great hall had stripped the woods bare faster than any war ever could. The fires devoured resources endlessly, yet delivered far less comfort than one might hope. There are humorous accounts, too. Guests sometimes quipped that noble fireplaces were large enough to roast an ox but too feeble to warm a man. The exaggeration carried truth. These vast hearths offered spectacle, light, noise, and a sense of grandeur, but against the stone's relentless chill, they provided little genuine relief. Some households sought clever fixes. Iron fire backs were placed behind the flames to reflect heat back into the chamber. Others lined hearths with decorated tiles, hoping they would store and slowly release warmth. Yet these were only partial solutions, small adjustments against a problem far larger than any trick could solve. Sit directly in front of a roaring fire and your face and feet might glow with heat, but your back would remain icy, and your bed across the room might as well have stood outdoors. Even scholars remain divided over just how effective castle fireplaces truly were. Some argue that, paired with wall hangings, carpets, and heavy furniture, they created a layered system of heat retention that did make rooms bearable. Others maintain they were mostly symbolic, rituals of status and power, since most of the energy simply vanished up the chimney. The truth likely shifted from castle to castle, shaped by design, resources, and climate. Now place yourself in such a chamber. The fire crackles and spits, sparks leaping onto the hearthstones. Smoke coils upward, leaving the faint tang of ash in the air. Your face grows hot, flushed from the glow, while your shoulders and back remain chilled. You inch closer, stretching out your hands until the fabric of your sleeves nearly smolders. But sooner or later you have to step away. Each pace back toward your bed brings a sharper drop in temperature, until by the time you slide under the blankets, it feels as though you've left the fire behind for the open night. Peasants, ironically, often fared better. Their cottages, small and smoky, held the heat of a single central hearth far more effectively. The cramped walls meant that the fire's warmth, mingled with the closeness of bodies spread throughout the space. Meanwhile, nobles with their cavernous halls and monumental fireplaces consumed forests of wood, only to sleep in rooms that remained half frozen. Once again, grandeur failed to translate into comfort. And yet the fire mattered deeply. It wasn't only about heat. It was about gathering, about light, about reassurance. People prayed by the fire, told stories by its glow, drifted into drowsy half-sleep in chairs pulled close to the flames. Even when the warmth reached no farther than a few steps, the glow itself provided psychological safety, an island of life in the cavernous dark. So when you imagine a medieval night, don't picture a roaring fire banishing the frost. Think instead of a fragile circle of warmth, a narrow oasis that lasted only as long as you remained nearby, and disappeared the moment you climbed into bed. The hearth, for all its promise, was as much theater as it was tool. And the medieval sleeper quickly learned to be thankful for whatever scraps of comfort it offered. You lean toward the glowing fire, and for a moment its light feels protective. But almost immediately, another reality intrudes: smoke. These fireplaces were not clean or efficient. They belched fumes, coated walls in soot, and filled chambers with a haze that stung the eyes and clung to every surface. To stay warm by fire was to breathe smoke nightly, to live with blackened walls, and to wake each morning with lungs rasped by ash. Chroniclers complained constantly about the problem. One monk in northern England grumbled that his cell grew so clogged with soot from the hearth that he coughed more than he prayed. Even nobles suffered. Court records preserve the laments of ladies whose fine gowns and linens grew permanently stained from the constant haze. A freshly cleaned tapestry might turn gray before winter had ended. Architecture only worsened the problem. Chimneys were enormous, crude shafts without the clever draft control of modern flues. Smoke did not always rise tidily. It drifted, eddied, and often curled back down into the room. A gust of wind from the wrong direction could send a black cloud pouring across the chamber, leaving everyone hacking and wiping their eyes. Imagine trying to drift into sleep while your throat burned raw and tears pricked your vision. Travelers' notes even mention an odd solution. Some households deliberately smeared their walls with lime wash or clay, not just to brighten interiors, but to disguise the streaks of soot. The black residue never truly vanished, but at least the illusion of freshness could be restored for a little while. Servants swept day after day, though the task seemed endless and often hopeless. Each winter repeated the same struggle, a constant fight against the smoke that choked the rooms and the cold that seeped through every stone wall. It was a cruel trade-off. Easing the chill only meant filling the air with soot, while letting the fire fade invited the frost to bite. Still, there was no choice. Fire was essential, and without it, no one could endure the bitter chill of a castle winter. So, people learned to accept the price. They draped smoke-stained tapestries as though they were marks of pride. They lived through coughing fits, wiping black dust from their faces each morning as part of daily life. Warmth demanded a sacrifice, and that sacrifice was the air they breathed. Now, as you rest in your modern bed tonight, inhaling fresh, invisible comfort without even thinking about it, pause to realize how extraordinary such ease truly is. For those in the Middle Ages, a cozy night's sleep always carried a cost. Every warm evening ended with a smoky morning. Their dreams lingered in the scent of burning wood, and their lives were constantly shadowed by soot. When the fire dwindled and the long hours of night stretched on, the only light left inside a medieval chamber often came from a lone candle. You might picture that flicker as nothing more than decoration, a soft touch of atmosphere. But to many sleepers it was more than that. It was a fragile source of comfort and a sliver of warmth. A single wick could never heat an entire room, of course, yet in a world where every bit of light and heat counted, even the smallest flame made a difference. Candles themselves carried their own story. In wealthy homes, beeswax candles were burned, offering a steady, clean light with a faint sweetness, like honey drifting through the air. These luxuries, however, were reserved for chapels, noble chambers, or special ceremonies. For most people, the glow came from tallow candles, crafted from rendered animal fat, cheaper, more common, and far less pleasant in scent. These candles often smoked and sputtered, releasing a greasy, lingering odor as they burned. Picture trying to fall asleep while the acrid stench of tallow filled the room, mixing with the damp chill of stone walls and the heavy musk of wool blankets. Yet despite their flaws, candles were more than just a source of light. Up close, they gave off a surprising amount of warmth. Place one near a bed curtain, and you might feel the fabric grow faintly warm beneath your hand. Some households discovered that grouping candles together could create a more noticeable effect. Stands holding several wicks burned at once, producing not only brighter illumination but also a small circle of heat that softened the edge of the cold, at least for those who sat nearby. It wasn't anything close to central heating, but it made a difference, enough to matter on bitter winter nights. One curious account from a 14th century letter describes a noblewoman who demanded 12 candles in her chamber every night during winter. She insisted that only then could she fall asleep in comfort. Her servants muttered about the wastefulness, but her insistence reveals an important truth. In those days, people leaned on light itself as a stand-in for warmth, even if the benefit was minimal. Of course, this practice carried obvious dangers. Flames were unstable, and the thick curtains of wool and linen that surrounded many beds were alarmingly flammable. Historical records tell of fires sparked by careless candle placement, with entire chambers reduced to ashes in moments. One particularly grim story from Germany recalls a squire who nodded off with a candle balanced on his bed rail. He woke to find his blankets ablaze and barely escaped with his life. Servants scolded him for being careless, but in truth, the real culprit was necessity. He had simply wanted a little more warmth within reach, and that small comfort nearly cost him everything. Scholars still debate how aware medieval people truly were of the risks that came with using candles. Some suggest that the sheer number of burned and blackened textiles found in records proves accidents were frequent but simply accepted as part of life. Others argue that the wealthy, at least, tried to manage the danger by assigning servants to keep watch over the flames long into the night. Whatever the truth, one reality remained constant. People were always weighing comfort against risk. Now imagine yourself inside such a chamber. The fire in the hearth has collapsed into faint embers, leaving the walls to dance with restless shadows. Near your bed, a single candle stands on a wooden holder, its small flame glowing softly, painting everything in shades of gold. As you pull the blankets closer, you notice the faint warmth reaching your skin, just enough to ease the sting of the cold air. The wick crackles, wax trickles down in slow, steady streams, and a thin haze of smoke lingers around you. Beyond the safety of your curtain, the rest of the room fades into total blackness. You tune into the delicate soundtrack of the night, the muted pop of the wick, the whisper of wind rattling the shutters, the quiet pad of melted wax dripping onto metal. In that moment, your entire world seems to shrink down to this fragile circle of light and warmth. The candle is no longer just a lamp, it feels like a companion, a fragile ally standing guard against the vastness of the dark. Scenes like this weren't unique to castles. In humbler cottages and roadside inns, the story played out in simpler forms. Travelers often set rush lights beside their straw pallets, slender reeds dipped in fat, burning fast and unevenly, sputtering as they hissed. Their glow was weak and short-lived, but even so, it offered reassurance to a weary soul. Parents, too, lit tiny lamps near their children, not only to push back the cold but to ease the fear of the night. Even monks, who valued simplicity and austerity above all else, permitted lamps to burn in their dormitories, justifying it as a matter of both safety and necessity. The sensory experience inside those halls was unforgettable. The air carried the heavy scent of melted fat mingled with smoke. Walls were streaked and darkened by months of soot. Bedclothes bore stains where hot wax had splattered and hardened. Yet none of this shocked or disturbed them. People accepted these imperfections as part of life. In the heart of winter, a candle was never just a decoration, it was survival itself. And so, as you lie beneath the calm glow of your clean electric light tonight, pause to picture that fragile medieval flame. It gave just enough warmth to lull the body into rest, while at the same time threatening ruin with every flicker. To fall asleep in the Middle Ages was never entirely free from worry. Even in the smallest details, tension lingered. Closing your eyes meant trusting that the delicate flame beside you would burn through the night without toppling, without transforming comfort into catastrophe. But life was not all noble chambers with curtains, feather beds, and watchful servants. Step outside those privileged rooms, and you enter a different world entirely, the communal dormitory. For monks, soldiers, apprentices, and servants, sleep was less about comfort and more about endurance. Take a monastery, for instance. Monastic rules demanded a life of simplicity, and that austerity carried into the way they slept. Dormitories were immense stone halls, long and echoing, lined with rows upon rows of beds or rough pallets. The floor stretched on like a cold, unbroken expanse, interrupted only by narrow windows high above that let in the faintest traces of light. Each monk had only a small space to call his own, a simple cot, a straw mattress, or sometimes nothing more than a wooden plank softened with a thin pad. The monks' beds were arranged side by side, so tightly spaced that each man could hear the steady breathing of the one beside him. Privacy was non-existent, yet there was one advantage: warmth came from proximity. Surviving accounts tell us that these dormitory halls were anything but quiet. Nights rang with the chorus of coughing and snoring, punctuated by the constant rustle of coarse woolen blankets. The air hung heavy, cold, damp, and dense, but the very press of so many bodies created a warmth no solitary chamber could ever match. One chronicler even remarked that a monastery's cloister was cozier than the tower of a lord, for the monks lay together like sheaves in a field. Life in military quarters pushed this communal existence even further. Soldiers billeted in castles or packed into campaign encampments filled long, drafty barrack halls. Men slept in endless rows on rough straw beds, their weapons stacked within arm's reach. Cloaks doubled as blankets, and when fabric ran short, men shared what little cover they had. The air reeked of sweat, leather, smoke, and straw, a pungent stew of humanity. Yet for the bone-tired, even this rough companionship was tolerable. Sleeping shoulder to shoulder was not just a necessity, it was a way to survive the night. Interestingly, some military and monastic rules specifically required candles to burn through the night in these communal halls. The light was practical, but also symbolic. It gave the men a fragile sense of comfort, as though the small flames could watch over them. The glow did little to raise the actual temperature, but it offered psychological warmth, the reassurance that the darkness was held at bay. The flame's presence mattered as much as, if not more than, its heat. Historians still debate the real reason behind communal sleeping. Was it primarily a practical measure, pooling body heat to resist the cold? Or was it intentional, a deliberate form of discipline to remind monks that luxury and privacy had no place in their vows? Perhaps it was both, necessity wrapped in philosophy. Some historians argue that the warmth of shared space was nothing more than a practical solution, yet it conveniently matched the spiritual ideals of humility and brotherhood. The same uncertainty applies to soldiers. Did they choose to bunk close together out of camaraderie, or was it simply because the cold made solitude impossible? The truth was probably a mixture of both necessity and fellowship. Now picture yourself lying in one of these crowded halls. The straw mattress beneath you crackles softly as you shift your weight. To your left, someone coughs. To your right, another man turns over. The vaulted ceiling catches and magnifies every sound, so that even the smallest movement echoes. The heavy scent of smoke and sweat hangs in the air, not pleasant, but far less biting than the sharp cold of a lonely chamber. Your coarse wool blanket scratches against your chin, and you pull it tighter, torn between irritation at the noise and gratitude for the warmth that comes from being surrounded by others. The rhythm of the dormitory soon becomes familiar. Snores rise and fall in uneven waves, interrupted by the occasional muttered dream. Somewhere in the darkness, a rat darts across the rush-strewn floor, but the men are too exhausted to stir. A draft slips in from the narrow windows high in the walls, yet the combined body heat dulls its sting. It may not be comfort in the way we think of it today, but it feels secure, safer, certainly, than sleeping alone in some cavernous stone chamber where the cold could bite unchallenged. Life for apprentices and household servants followed much the same pattern. Castles were honeycombed with side chambers, lofts, and forgotten corners where young boys or maidservants rolled out their straw pallets. Some slept beneath staircases, others in storerooms, anywhere there was floor space. They piled on cloaks and huddled close together, transforming the most unremarkable spaces into makeshift bedrooms. Unlike the nobility, they had no feather beds or brass warming pans. What they did have, however, was proximity, and that closeness meant their smaller, crowded quarters often held warmth better than the drafty rooms of their masters. The sensory world of these communal spaces was unlike anything we would consider restful today. The coarse scratch of wool against bare skin, the musky odor of bodies packed tightly together, the steady hum of breathing layered with the occasional snore, the rustle of straw shifting beneath restless limbs, even the soft drip of water from a leaky roof above, it all formed the backdrop of medieval rest. It wasn't peace in the modern sense, but it was endurance. People didn't expect silence, comfort, or solitude. What they expected, above all else, was survival. So tonight, as you stretch out in your own quiet bed, pause to imagine those vast halls, monks chanting their evening prayers before dousing the lamps, soldiers collapsing shoulder to shoulder after a day of battle, servants huddling together in narrow stairwells or hidden alcoves. Their warmth did not come from silk sheets or fur blankets, but from the closeness of one another. In the Middle Ages, sleep was as much about community as it was about rest, a reminder that even in the coldest stone castles, survival was rarely an individual act. You've now pictured yourself lying in this crowded dormitory, but even here, warmth was never a guarantee. Fires had to be kept alive, and through the long hours of night, someone was always forced to rise, stumble across the floor, and coax the embers back to life. Medieval sleep was almost never uninterrupted. People woke often, sometimes because of the discomfort of straw bedding, sometimes from the coughing of a neighbor, and sometimes simply because the fire demanded tending. Their very rhythm of sleep differed from ours. Unlike today's expectation of 8 unbroken hours, medieval people lived by what scholars now call segmented sleep. The first sleep began soon after nightfall, carrying people a few hours into the dark. Around midnight they would stir awake, sometimes to feed the fire, sometimes to whisper prayers, and sometimes to check on animals, children, or the safety of their home. After an hour or two of quiet wakefulness, most people would settle back into what was called the second sleep, lasting until dawn. In the coldest months, this midnight interval often centered on one pressing task, keeping the fire alive. Without constant attention, the embers would die, and by morning the chamber would be as bitter as the outdoors. A famous example comes from the writings of a 15th century physician, who actually recommended this break between first and second sleep as an opportunity for reflection, conversation, or even intimacy. To him, this pattern was perfectly natural, an accepted part of the human body's rhythm. But for the castle servant padding across frozen stone floors to feed logs into a hearth, it was far less philosophical. His concern was not self-reflection but duty. He bent low, listened for the faint crackle of wood, blew into the embers until they glowed, and prayed they would catch before the cold overtook the room. Rural accounts tell us of another custom, families often divided the responsibility of firekeeping. In large communal halls, each adult took turns rising in the dark to tend the flames. Monastic life had its own variation. Bells rang at intervals through the night, calling monks to prayer, and as a byproduct, ensuring that someone was always awake to watch the fire. In this way, medieval sleep was never a private retreat from the world. It was a shared rhythm, punctuated by constant responsibility. Scholars still debate whether segmented sleep was truly universal or more pronounced in certain regions, particularly northern Europe, where the long stretch of winter darkness made a single, continuous rest impractical. Some argue that this pattern was dictated purely by necessity. The environment shaped the schedule. Others suggest it was just as much a cultural habit, something people learned to expect regardless of geography. The debate continues, but one fact remains undisputed. Throughout the Middle Ages, fire was the heartbeat of the night. It shaped when people woke, when they slept, and how they endured the dark hours until morning. Picture yourself waking in the dead of night. Around you, the hall is hushed except for the steady chorus of snores. You push back your blanket, and at once the air bites at your skin like a cold slap. Shivering, you grope for a log and rise from your bed. Straw crunches under your feet with every step, and your breath curls upward in pale plumes as you kneel by the hearth. Your fingers sting while you stir the fading embers, coaxing life back into their dull glow. Sparks flare, the wood resists, then finally catches. Slowly, warmth begins to pulse outward again into the chamber. You let out a quiet sigh of relief, knowing that, thanks to you, your companions will sleep peacefully for a few more hours. The sensations cling in memory. The pop and crackle of fresh wood. The faint halo of light pushing shadows back into the corners. The thick smell of smoke settling over wool blankets and rough stone walls. Your hands ache, but as you crawl back under the covers, the revived heat makes the bed feel even warmer than before. Peasants in their cottages lived by this same rhythm, though in harsher circumstances. Their hearths rarely had protective grates. Fires burned directly on the floor, open and vulnerable. A careless sleeper risked more than discomfort. They risked their home, their lives. And so someone always rose, night after night, to adjust the logs, stir the coals, and keep watch. Sleep came in fragments, never a long, unbroken stretch, but always tethered to the needs of the fire. This is the truth of medieval nights. They were not passive stretches of unconsciousness. They were managed, negotiated, and guarded. People rose to tend flames, to pray, to whisper with a spouse, to check on animals, to hush children back to rest, and only then return to sleep. In the darkness, life never truly stopped. It slowed, yes, but continued, marked by the rhythm of firelight and breath. So as you lie beneath your clean, steady warmth tonight, imagine the vigilance once required in those vast stone halls. Closing your eyes was never absolute. It was an act of trust, that the flame would hold, that the night would pass, and that the morning would come. To fall asleep in the Middle Ages was an act of trust that someone would rise in time, feed the fire, and keep the cold from swallowing the room before dawn. You've tended the embers yourself, crept back beneath the covers, and tried to calm your racing thoughts. But there was another path to warmth, one less practical and more indulgent, born from the desire for comfort rather than necessity. For some, the dream of a hot bath before bed lingered like a fantasy of luxury. Bathing in the Middle Ages was no simple task. Heating the water demanded vast amounts of fuel, and the tubs themselves were heavy, awkward wooden vessels. A warm soak was never part of daily routine. It was an occasion, an event, often communal, and always treasured. Yet for those with the wealth to afford it, lowering themselves into steaming water on a winter's night felt nothing short of magical. Chroniclers paint vivid images, noble women easing into cloth-lined tubs as curls of steam rose into the lamplight, attendants waiting nearby with warm towels at the ready. To step from that bath and slide between sheets was to enjoy, for a fleeting moment, the illusion that winter had been defeated. One curious account from Paris even describes wealthy citizens who ordered tubs placed close to fireplaces, so that when the bather emerged, the chamber already glowed with welcoming heat. The air, thick with the scent of rosemary or thyme sprinkled into the water, carried not only fragrance but also the promise of supposed medicinal benefit. Skin tingled, cheeks flushed, and the body, for once, felt primed for deep, restorative rest. But luxuries such as these were rare. Most people sought smaller, more accessible comforts before bed: a humble cup of warm ale, a mug of spiced wine, or a sip of hot mead. These simple drinks provided a glow from within, a little warmth to carry into the night. The warmth from those drinks spread slowly inward, radiating from the chest, coaxing the body toward drowsiness. But liquid comfort wasn't the only strategy. Some households placed stones by the hearth, heating them until they glowed with stored energy. Wrapped in cloth, they were slipped beneath blankets at the foot of the bed, primitive hot water bottles that released gentle heat for hours. A stranger custom survives in one account of noble families who filled leather pouches with heated sand, tucking them between the sheets. Sand held warmth longer than stone and, unlike a rigid block, molded itself to the body's shape. Imagine sliding your icy feet against such a pouch, sighing as the sting of cold gradually melted into comfort. The ingenuity is remarkable. Faced with brutal winters, people adapted with whatever resources they had: stone, sand, fire, or cloth, transforming simple materials into fragile luxuries. Even so, historians still debate how common these comforts truly were. Were heated stones and mulled drinks ordinary practices across many households? Or were they the rare indulgences of the wealthy, remembered precisely because they stood out? Some argue these habits were widespread, within reach of most families in some modest form. Others insist they were exceptional, luxuries tied to privilege. Either way, the very fact that historians argue the point is a reminder that comfort itself was never guaranteed. It was a contested privilege. Now, picture yourself in this imagined chamber. You sit before the hearth, watching as a servant pours steaming mulled wine into a cup. The sharp fragrance of cinnamon and cloves curls through the air, momentarily disguising the ever-present sense of smoke, damp stone, and wool. You lift the cup and drink slowly, feeling warmth bloom through your chest. Your eyelids grow heavy, your limbs begin to loosen. By the time you climb into bed, the blankets no longer feel suffocating or cold. Instead, they welcome you, and for a moment, winter feels distant. At the foot of your bed, a stone swaddled in cloth glows faintly with stored heat, pressing its warmth against your toes. For once, you do not dread the long night ahead. The impressions are vivid: the sweet tang of spiced wine lingering on your tongue, the soft hiss of a log collapsing into embers, the tingling heat of stones soaking slowly into your skin. Surrounded by these sensations, you drift towards slumber, your body momentarily convinced that comfort is not just possible, but real. And yet, here lies the truth: such indulgences were fleeting. Heat slipped away quickly. Stones cooled, drinks went tepid, and by midnight the chill crept back, seeping into every corner of the chamber. These rituals were never about permanent relief. They were about creating brief pockets of grace, moments of ease that made the endless cold bearable. So, as you rest tonight beneath your steady, modern warmth, consider how deeply medieval people longed for such comfort. They invented clever tricks, sought small indulgences, and turned even a steaming cup of ale into a survival tactic. Their nights were rarely easy, but they were marked by ingenuity. Every bath, every heated stone, every sip of mulled wine was not just an act of comfort. It was a quiet rebellion against the cold. But physical measures were only part of the battle. For medieval people, the cold was not simply a bodily enemy, it carried spiritual weight as well. The night itself was viewed with suspicion, the air thought capable of carrying illness or even harboring malevolent forces. Darkness was dangerous, and so, people looked beyond fire and stone. They sought protection through charms, rituals, and superstition, weaving the spiritual into their nightly defenses. One of the most commonly recorded practices was the hanging of amulets above the bed, talismans meant to guard the sleeper from harm. These protective charms could take many forms. Some were simple crosses, roughly carved from wood. Others were small relics, believed to hold the sacred power of saints. Still others were humble pouches filled with herbs. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were especially favored. These plants were thought to repel not only evil spirits, but also the night air itself, which many believed carried poison and sickness. Imagine lying in bed beneath a canopy hung with fragrant bundles, their sharp, earthy scents mingling with the smoke of the hearth and the heavy musk of wool blankets. Prayers formed another kind of shield. Monastic rules often instructed brothers to recite psalms before lying down, their voices blending into a low chant across the dormitory. Noble families, too, knelt at their bedside to whisper paternosters or the Ave Maria. Even peasants, though, had their own whispered charms, half prayer, half incantation, spoken as they crossed themselves against frostbite, fever, or misfortune. Parents sometimes leaned over their children, murmuring verses while pressing a kiss on a small forehead, protection against the dreaded night hag, a shadowy figure blamed for sitting on the chest of sleepers and stealing their breath. Some customs were stranger still. A German household manual from the 15th century advised sleepers to place iron objects, like a knife or a pair of scissors, beneath the bed or even under the pillow. Iron was thought to repel demons and fairies, unseen intruders who might creep in under the cover of darkness. In the flicker of firelight, that glint of metal became a silent sentinel. And then there were the rituals directly tied to warmth. One folk belief claimed that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would keep frost from creeping into your toes. Another promised that if you whispered the names of 3 saints before extinguishing the candle, your body's heat would stay with you through the night. To us, these may sound like quaint superstitions. But for them, they were as essential as an extra blanket, practical strategies woven seamlessly with faith and fear. Scholars remain divided on how seriously medieval people believed in these nightly rituals. Some argue that charms, prayers, and blessings were heartfelt, woven so deeply into daily life that they shaped how people understood the world. Others suggest they were performed more out of custom, gestures repeated because tradition demanded it, whether or not faith truly lingered behind the act. But whichever view is right, the rituals reveal something crucial. Sleep itself was never fully trusted. It was a time of vulnerability, when cold, illness, and unseen forces could strike without warning. People felt they needed defenses, both physical and spiritual, before surrendering to the night. Picture yourself lying in a medieval bed. The curtains are drawn, shutting out the draft. The fire burns low, its glow reduced to faint red embers. Shadows pool in the corners of the chamber. Above you hangs a sprig of juniper, its sharp, resinous scent cutting through the haze of smoke. Beneath your pillow lies a small iron knife, invisible but reassuring, a silent guardian against whatever lurks unseen. You whisper a prayer, the words soft and steady, and cross yourself before pulling the blankets tighter. The chamber feels less menacing now, as if these small gestures have carved a fragile circle of protection around your body. The sensory details root themselves in memory, the gentle brush of herbs shifting against the canopy, the faint metallic tang of iron so close to your head, the coarse warmth of wool wrapping your skin, and the lingering rhythm of whispered words still echoing in your chest. In that single moment, faith, superstition, and survival are no longer separate, they are one. Peasants practiced much the same, though their tools were simpler. Where nobles might place relics or finely bound charms, the common folk relied on carved wooden figures, knotted cords, or herbs gathered from nearby fields. Parents tucked garlic beneath their children's pillows, convinced it could drive away both disease and spirits alike. And these protections extended even beyond the household. Animals, too, were folded into the web of nightly rituals. Even livestock were drawn into these nightly rituals. Cows and sheep and their byres were sometimes blessed before nightfall, their presence believed to lend strength to the household and help guard against the creeping frost. Across every class of society, the night was never faced with cloth and fire alone. Rituals stood beside them. The medieval mind sought warmth in the body and protection in the unseen. To close one's eyes was to step into mystery, a realm where prayer, herbs, iron, and flame worked together to hold back the dangers of darkness. So as you tuck yourself into night, imagine those gestures, shoes turned upside down at the bedside, a sprig of rosemary tied above the bed frame, the names of 3 saints whispered into the shadows. These may seem small to us, intangible comforts, but to a medieval sleeper they were powerful. Survival was never purely physical, it was also spiritual armor, woven from faith, habit, and hope. Now step back from the bed itself and consider the chamber as a whole. Beyond the layers of blankets, the warmth of dogs, or the presence of charms, the very architecture of a room played a role in shaping how well its occupants could endure the night. Castles, first and foremost, were built for defense, their thick stone walls designed to withstand sieges, not to provide comfort. Yet over time, builders began to experiment, trying to carve livable spaces out of unforgiving stone. What emerged was a patchwork of solutions, some practical, some symbolic, all intended to wrest warmth from cold walls. One such innovation was the solar, a private chamber reserved for the lord and his family. Unlike the cavernous great hall where much of castle life unfolded, the solar was smaller, tucked higher within the building, and easier to heat. It typically featured its own fireplace, walls draped with thick hangings, and windows that faced the path of the sun. This wasn't luxury in the way we think of it today, it was strategy. By reducing the size of the space, the fire's warmth had a chance to linger. Even tapestries served more than decorative purposes. Woven from wool or silk, tapestries did more than brighten bare stone, they draped walls with color and narrative. Their surfaces teemed with saints, hunts, and mythical beasts, turning cold chambers into story-filled sanctuaries. Yet their purpose was as practical as it was decorative. A single hanging might stretch 10 or even 20 feet across, so heavy that it took several servants to lift it into place. Once secured, the damp stone behind it was concealed, and the air along the wall turned just a little less frigid. Step close, and you might even catch the earthy, lanolin scent of wool, faint but strangely comforting. Archaeological surveys reveal that many chambers also featured wooden paneling, often oak, installed for the same reason. These boards created a buffer, trapping small pockets of air so that the space felt less like a cavern. Servants stuffed the gaps with tow, moss, or rags to block drafts sneaking through the cracks. The system was never perfect, but it showed the lengths to which people went to make stone fortresses habitable. Estate records tell a curious story. Nobles treated their finest tapestries as essential travel gear. When households moved from castle to castle, the hangings were rolled up and carried along, like portable walls. They weren't only works of art, they were survival tools. A lord without his tapestries was as vulnerable as a knight without his armor. Specialists in medieval domestic life still debate how effective such measures really were. Some argue they made a noticeable difference, cutting drafts and holding heat in a way that truly changed the climate of a room. Others insist the effect was largely psychological, that the sight of vibrant fabric glowing in the firelight simply felt warmer, even if the temperature barely shifted. Either way, the debate highlights the subtle interplay between perception and survival. Now picture yourself stepping into such a chamber, walls wrapped in rich cloth, the fire blazing in the hearth, flickering light dancing across silk or wool, and the cold stone hidden from view. The heavy door closes behind you, and at once the howl of the wind in the corridor is muted. Inside, the walls are draped with crimson and gold tapestries, their woven figures half illuminated by candlelight. A fire crackles in a carved stone hearth, its smoke curling upward into the gloom. Overhead, the timber ceiling feels closer than in the cavernous great hall below, giving the space a more intimate atmosphere. It is still cold, you can see your breath plume in the air, but it feels less hostile here, softened by the smaller scale of the room. The experience is layered on your senses, the rough weave of tapestry brushing your fingertips, the faint scent of lanolin from wool mingling with wood smoke, the sharp sound of logs snapping as the fire takes hold. For a moment, you can almost believe this is a refuge, though you know the cold waits just beyond the fabric walls, ready to seep back in. Peasants mirrored the same principle in simpler ways. Instead of silken or woolen hangings, they smeared their walls with plaster or wattle, then covered them with rough cloth or patched blankets to block the worst of the drafts. Sometimes a painted cloth with bold, simple patterns served double duty: decoration to brighten a room, and insulation to shrink its space into something more livable. Architecture itself offered another quiet trick. Sleeping chambers were often placed on upper floors, where rising heat from the great hall below offered even the slightest advantage. Children were sometimes tucked into lofts directly above kitchens, where the warmth of ovens lingered through the night. These arrangements had little to do with privacy and everything to do with capturing stray degrees of heat wherever they could be found. And yet, for all these clever adaptations, the cold never truly left. At best, you could push it back, soften its edges, delay its bite. But you could never banish it completely. The grip of winter always remained. Still, the presence of wall hangings, solar chambers, and wooden panels shows just how deeply medieval people longed to transform their stone fortresses into something resembling a home. As you lie in your modern bed tonight, picture those rooms glowing faintly with firelight, their walls softened by bright cloth and heavy tapestries, their chill blunted, if only slightly, by wooden boards. By our standards, they were far from cozy. Yet they were acts of defiance. Against the stone, against the frost, against the endless night of winter, the medieval household layered architecture, art, and ritual together as if to declare, this space is ours. Here, at least, we will endure. Now close your eyes and imagine the smell of a medieval bedroom. Forget the lavender-scented image conjured by modern advertisements for linen and laundry. Instead, the air was thick, a stew of odors layered upon one another from the moment you pushed through the heavy wooden door. To truly understand how people slept, you must first understand what they breathed, for every inhalation reminded them of the world they lived in. The first and most inescapable scent was smoke. In winter, fires burned almost constantly, yet chimneys were crude and inefficient. Soot drifted back into the room, staining walls, settling into curtains, and embedding itself deep into blankets. The air itself grew heavy, every breath carrying the tang of ash. Even freshly laundered linen couldn't escape it. Within days, it smelled of smoke again. At night you would lay your head down with that scent clinging to your hair, your clothing, even your skin. Then came the smell of damp wool. Blankets, cloaks, and garments rarely dried fully during the long, wet months. Moisture crept through stone walls, condensed on cold surfaces, and seeped into every textile. Wool absorbed it greedily, holding the chill and releasing the sour, earthy scent of dampness as you wrapped yourself in it. Wool carried its scent stubbornly, an earthy, lanolin-rich smell with a faint sourness that never quite went away. Imagine pulling the covers up to your chin, the fabric radiating warmth yet never smelling truly fresh. Every breath reminded you of damp fibers, clinging to the cold and holding it close. To this, add the smell of straw and rushes. Floors were spread with them, beds stuffed with them, and they rarely stayed clean. Boots trampled them down, spills soaked into them, and mice made homes within them. Rushes grew musty quickly, and while straw mattresses released a sweet, grassy scent when new, that freshness never lasted. After weeks of use, the straw turned rank, heavy with sweat, spills, and decay. Each shift in bed sent another puff of that earthy odor rising into the chamber. A 14th-century household manual offers a telling detail. It recommended sprinkling dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, meadow flowers, over the rushes to sweeten the room. And for a few days it worked. The sharp fragrance mingled with the heavier odors, masking them just enough to pass as civilized. But soon enough, the herbs wilted, crushed beneath feet, their perfume fading into the background. The sourness of old rushes inevitably returned. And then, of course, there was the human smell. Hygiene was limited, baths infrequent, and sweat ever present. People often slept in the same layers of clothing they had worn throughout the day: wool cloaks, linen shifts, leather garments, all of them absorbing and releasing the odor of unwashed skin. In shared beds, the scents mingled, pressing one person's warmth and musk against another's. For some, the smell of other bodies might have been reassuring, a sign of life and closeness. For others, it could feel stifling, almost suffocating. Scholars still debate how overwhelming these smells truly were. Some argue that medieval people, so accustomed to constant exposure, hardly noticed them at all, that the scents blended into the background of life, as ordinary as the cold or the smoke. Other historians argue the opposite, that medieval people were acutely aware of these odors, which is precisely why they prized herbs, perfumes, and incense so highly. Evidence from household inventories and medical texts seems to support this view. Complaints about foul air appear often, alongside recommended remedies and attempts to counteract it. The debate itself reminds us of something essential. Smell was not an afterthought in the medieval world. It was central to the experience of daily life, and central to the experience of sleep. Now place yourself in such a room. The fire has burned low, leaving behind only the acrid tang of smoke clinging to the air. Your coarse wool blanket itches at your chin, carrying the faint sourness of dampness. Each time you shift, the straw beneath you exhales a musty breath, like old grass rotting in the dark. From the floor comes the faint rustle of rushes as mice scurry through crumbs left from supper. Beside you, a companion exhales heavily, his breath warm but thick with the scent of sweat and ale. And above it all, barely noticeable now, floats the faint trace of rosemary, sprinkled days ago in an effort to sweeten the chamber, its fragrance fading, unable to mask the stew of odor. The sensory reality presses in on you. It fills your nose, settles in your lungs, and etches itself into memory. You cough, tug the covers higher, and try to breathe shallowly until sleep arrives. This was not unusual. This was normal. This was life. Peasants endured the same, though on a smaller scale. Their cottages were often shared with livestock, cows, sheep, even chickens, whose presence added pungent layers to the air. What visiting city dwellers found unbearable, villagers accepted as a fact of survival. Yet even in these humble homes, herbs were used as small defenses. Bunches of mint or chamomile might hang from the rafters, meant partly for fragrance, partly to ward off pests. For nobles, perfumes and incense sometimes offered a more refined solution. Sweet smoke drifting from censers or a vial of imported oil dabbed on linen could, for a moment, transform the air. Incense smoldered in braziers, releasing a sweetness that curled through the air, though it often mingled uneasily with the ever-present smoke and damp. Perfumed oils, dabbed onto clothes or pressed into linen, created small pockets of fragrance, brief sanctuaries in an otherwise heavy atmosphere. Yet even the richest chamber could never fully escape the fundamental odors of medieval life. So when you imagine sleep within a castle, do not picture crisp linen or clean, cool air. Instead, picture a medley: the acrid smoke of the hearth, the sour dampness of wool, the earthy must of straw, the musk of sweat, the sharpness of herbs, and sometimes, the pungency of nearby animals. Every night, every breath reminded sleepers of where they lived and what they endured. Smell was not an afterthought. It was as much a part of medieval rest as blankets or fire. And perhaps, over time, the very familiarity of those odors brought a measure of comfort. To inhale smoke, wool, and straw was to inhale the essence of home. For the medieval sleeper, scent was not just inconvenience. It was identity, woven into every dream and memory of the night. Yet beyond smoke and wool and musty straw, another force helped people survive the long, frozen hours: food and drink. Supper may not seem like part of sleep, but what was eaten before bed, and the warmth it gave inside the body, mattered every bit as much as blankets. In winter, households leaned heavily on hearty pottages, thick stews made from barley, peas, and root vegetables, simmered for hours in great black cauldrons. These meals clung to the body, settling deep in the stomach, leaving a fullness that dulled the edge of hunger and made the cold easier to bear. The lingering heat of broth radiated outward, a glow from within, convincing you, at least for a while, that you could endure another freezing chamber, another long night. In noble households, the evening pottage might be enriched with luxuries, meat, cream, or costly spices, while peasants filled their bowls with onions, cabbage, and whatever scraps could be gathered from the fields or the market. A curious note survives in a 15th century English manuscript, which recommends eating leeks at night because they warm the belly and chase away the chill of death. Whether or not such advice worked in practice, it reveals how closely people linked diet with warmth and survival. A hot meal was not just sustenance, it was insulation from within, a shield against the long, cold hours ahead. Drinks played an equally vital role. Ale was the most common, consumed by rich and poor alike, and in winter it was often served warm. It filled bellies with calories, offered hydration, and provided a kind of liquid comfort that reached deeper than plain water. For the nobility, more refined options existed. Spiced wine, known as hippocras, was a favorite. Heated gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, and cloves imported from distant lands, it was both status symbol and sleeping aid. Picture yourself in a smoky chamber, cup in hand. The sharp sweetness of exotic spices rises with the steam, mingling with the ever-present smells of wool and ash. The wine burns warmly in your throat, then spreads outward, leaving you drowsy, heavy-limbed, and convinced that, at least for tonight, winter has loosened its grip. Even physicians recommended such practices. A record from the court of Charles VI of France notes that his doctor prescribed hot meat at night to prevent cold from entering the bones. The idea is not far removed from our modern ritual of tea before bed, though medieval science explained it through the lens of humoral theory, the belief that warm, moist drinks restored balance to the body's inner fluids. Historians still debate how much alcohol actually contributed to warmth, and how much of it was an illusion. Some argue that ale, wine, and mead simply dulled perception, tricking the body into feeling warmer than it truly was. But for the medieval sleeper, perception itself often meant survival. Some argue that the true value of these evening drinks came from the calories they carried, providing real energy to push through the bitter cold nights. Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the middle, a combination of physical warmth and the comfort of believing you were cared for. Picture yourself getting ready for sleep. A servant approaches and offers a wooden cup of mulled wine. Steam curls upward, carrying the rich scent of spices straight into your nose. You take a sip, the warm liquid glowing as it slides down your throat. Almost instantly, your body softens, your muscles unwind, and your eyelids grow heavy. By the time you settle beneath the covers, the blankets seem lighter, almost welcoming, as if the warmth is already flowing inside you. For peasants, the custom was humbler but no less meaningful. Instead of wine, it was often a bowl of hot porridge thickened with oats or barley, filling and steadying the stomach. Families gathered close to the hearth, their faces lit by the flicker of firelight, their bodies fed and ready for the long night. Children scraped the last bits from their wooden spoons before curling beneath rough blankets, the memory of food's warmth helping them ignore the chilly drafts that slipped through the shutters. One curious belief held that eating garlic before bed could ward off frostbite. Whether it was truly because garlic aided circulation, or simply because its sharp, fiery taste made people feel warmer, the tradition persisted. Farmers in the harshest climates would even chew raw cloves before sleep, the pungent smell filling the chamber as strongly as smoke or damp wool. The sensory experience of medieval nighttime meals was vivid and unforgettable. The bubbling pot over the fire, the hiss of wine as it heated, the mingled aromas of herbs and spices drifting through the air, the damp scent of rushes on the floor, and the heavy, comforting weight of stew resting in the stomach. Every bite and every sip played a role in the battle against the cold. So when you picture medieval sleep, don't think of it as separate from the supper that came before. Food was more than just nourishment. It was fuel, warmth, and in many ways a kind of medicine. Without it, the chill bit harder, the blankets felt thinner, and the night stretched endlessly. With it, the body had a fighting chance. Each spoonful, each swallow, was like adding an invisible quilt inside you, a hidden layer of defense against the icy stone pressing in from every side. Now imagine those most at risk within the castle walls, the children and the elderly. Their bodies, fragile and less resistant to cold, suffered most under winter's harsh grip. Where a strong adult knight or servant might manage to shiver through the darkness, a child could wake with lips tinged blue, and an elderly woman might not wake at all. Their survival depended on careful attention, the support of others, and at times, nothing more than luck. Noble household records reveal that children were rarely granted their own chambers. Instead, they were tucked into nurseries close to the heat of the kitchens or placed among servants for added protection. Young pages and squires, training for future duties, often slept together in crowded dormitories, their whispers and laughter eventually fading beneath shared blankets. The reasoning was practical. More bodies meant more warmth. Babies, the most fragile of all, were swaddled tightly in multiple layers of linen and wool. Cradles were set near the hearth, or in many cases, placed directly in the mother's bed so that her body heat could shield the infant from the bitter air. A moving account from a 14th century chronicle tells of a noble child laid in a wicker crib by the fire, wrapped in furs and sheltered beneath a canopy, a small but desperate effort to keep life burning through the cold. This detail alone shows the lengths families were willing to go in order to safeguard their youngest members. And yet, despite all that care, countless lives were still lost to illness and cold. Medieval parents carried a constant, gnawing fear that winter might quietly steal a child in the middle of the night. The elderly faced much the same danger. With bodies too frail to generate enough warmth and far less tolerance for drafts, they often suffered the cruelest blows of the season. In peasant cottages, grandparents were typically given the warmest place nearest the fire, while younger adults endured the colder edges of the room. In castles, aging relatives were moved into smaller chambers that trapped heat better, or in some cases, relocated directly into the kitchens during the harshest months. One curious letter from Burgundy tells of an elderly matron who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse itself, claiming the lingering heat from the ovens gave her a second youth. It's a striking reminder of how precious every degree of warmth could be. Medical texts from the era frequently stressed special precautions for both the very young and the very old. Physicians advised placing heated stones, wrapped in cloth, at their feet, or offering mulled drinks thought to strengthen the body's humors. They warned that a sudden chill could snuff out the fragile flame of life entirely, a vivid reminder of just how vulnerable these groups were. Even today, historians debate whether medieval families went out of their way to offer children and elders extra protection, or if they simply folded them into the same survival routines as everyone else. Some argue that the consistent emphasis on safeguarding them reveals a deep compassion that cuts through the centuries. Some historians argue that high mortality rates prove there were limits to what families could truly do. No matter how much care was given, illness and cold still claimed lives. This constant tension, between love and inevitability, shaped how medieval people thought about both childhood and old age. Now, picture a winter's night in a simple peasant cottage. A baby lies tightly swaddled, his tiny face barely peeking out from the cloth. Nearby, a grandmother snores softly beside the hearth, the fading glow of embers casting her cheeks in a faint red. Parents lean over them both, tucking cloaks and blankets to ensure they hold the warmest places. Children sprawl together on a straw-filled mattress, whispering and giggling until exhaustion pulls them into silence. The room smells of porridge, smoke, and wool, yet beneath all of that lingers the deeper warmth of being surrounded by family. Inside a castle, the picture shifts but remains just as striking. A nursemaid rocks a cradle by the fire, humming a lullaby while a child whimpers against the chill. Upstairs, an aging noblewoman demands that her bed curtains be drawn tight while a servant slides heated stones to the foot of her bed. She fingers her rosary and murmurs prayers, afraid of the cold's silent reach. In both cottages and castles, the story was the same. The very young and the very old required the most care, and even then, survival wasn't guaranteed. The smallest details take on weight. The crackle of logs being fed into the fire, the faint rustle of swaddling cloth, the shuffle of an old man pulling blankets closer. You can almost feel the fragility in the air, as though the cold itself was waiting patiently for a moment of weakness to strike. So when you think of medieval sleep, remember, it was never the same for everyone. Children and elders carried the heaviest burden, their lives hanging on the warmth and protection provided by others. On those endless nights, every blanket mattered, every ember mattered, and every whispered prayer carried the weight of survival. These stories remind us that medieval sleep wasn't just about individual toughness. It was about community. The young and the old survived winter only because others watched over them with care and vigilance. The cold was more than a discomfort to be endured. It wasn't simply something that gnawed at skin and bone. It was seen as a force that shaped health itself. To the medieval mind, chill was dangerous. It could disturb the body's inner balance and open the door to illness. Medicine of the era revolved around the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and physicians believed temperature played a central role in keeping these fluids in harmony. Too much cold, they warned, caused the humors to congeal, clogging the body and bringing sickness. Medical texts from the 13th and 14th centuries overflow with advice on how to counter this threat at night. One manual suggested rubbing warm oil into the feet before bed, claiming it opened the pores and expelled harmful chill. Another recommended a cup of heated milk with honey, said to calm the stomach and prevent the humors from slowing down. In this view, warmth itself was a form of medicine, delivered through food, drink, clothing, and even the shared heat of other bodies. One striking account comes from a French surgeon who warned that sleeping in damp rooms could chill the black bile and breed melancholy. His solution? Hang thick tapestries on the walls, not for decoration, but for health. Imagine being told by your doctor that failing to properly furnish your bedroom might lead to depression. This shows just how tightly climate and medicine were linked in the medieval world. Alongside learned medical theory, folk cures thrived in every household. Some swore that rubbing garlic or onion on the soles of the feet before bed would stop the chill from seeping into the body. Others tied little charms of wool soaked in wine around their wrists as protection. One especially curious English herbal even recommended keeping a live rooster in the bedroom, claiming the bird would draw the frost away from a person. Whether anyone truly slept with a restless chicken nearby is hard to say, but the very idea reveals the depth of people's desperation for remedies. Modern scholars still argue over how effective these practices actually were. Some suggest that oils, warm drinks, and herbal concoctions may have provided modest relief, stimulating circulation and offering a sense of comfort. Others dismiss most of them as symbolic at best, their power lying more in belief than in biology. The debate continues, but one thing is certain: medieval people trusted wholeheartedly in these nightly rituals. Now, place yourself in that world for a moment. You sit near the hearth while a servant rubs warm oil into your feet, the scent of rosemary filling the chamber. You sip a small cup of hot wine sweetened with honey, feeling it coat your throat as it goes down. A sprig of garlic rests near your bed, pungent, odd, but believed to ward off frost. Finally, you slip beneath the covers, convinced that these rituals will keep your humors in balance until dawn. The entire experience is overwhelming to the senses: heat, fragrance, taste, and touch blending together in the nightly fight against the cold. The slick feel of warm oil against your skin, the sweet tang of honeyed wine, the sharp bite of garlic lingering in the air, every sensation reminds you that sleep in the Middle Ages was not just rest. It was a kind of medicine, a nightly therapy meant to protect the body from imbalance. Peasants, too, turned to their own remedies. Women brewed herbal teas of nettle or chamomile for their children, convinced that the soothing warmth kept coughs at bay. Men sometimes wrapped their legs in strips of wool soaked with vinegar, believing it kept blood flowing and circulation strong. In cottages like these, the line between superstition and science blurred, but these practices gave families a sense of control in a world where illness always seemed close at hand. Ironically, some of the very strategies people used to fight off the cold often created new problems. Fires filled lungs with smoke, heavy layers of bedding could leave joints aching, and oily ointments trapped dirt against the skin. Yet for medieval minds, these were small sacrifices compared to the greater danger of frost creeping into the body. Better to cough in a smoky room, they reasoned, than to shiver in a clean one. So when you picture medieval sleep, don't think only of rough blankets and drafty chambers. Think of it as a nightly act of medicine, guided by theories of health, rituals that were part cure and part charm, and an ever-present fear that cold might tip the delicate balance of life. Each night was its own medical event. Every blanket and herb felt like a prescription, every ember in the fire was a treatment, and closing your eyes meant trusting that all of these efforts would be enough to carry you safely until morning. And still, there were nights when none of it was enough. Step into a castle chamber at the height of winter, and you might witness something unsettling: frost blooming on the inside walls. Picture lying in bed and seeing delicate lace-like crystals spread across the stone, or waking to find your wash basin frozen solid, the water inside transformed into a block of glass. The cold did not respect the boundary between outdoors and in. It crept inside, leaving its own cruel decorations. Chroniclers tell of entire households waking to frost on their bed curtains. One noblewoman described in a letter how her canopy sparkled as though embroidered with silver. Beautiful to imagine, perhaps, but for her it was grim evidence that even a richly furnished chamber offered little real protection. Archaeology adds weight to these accounts. In preserved castles, faint salt streaks and moisture stains show where condensation collected on walls and floors. With no insulation, warm indoor air collided with freezing stone, and frost claimed the room night after night. Servants would scrape ice away each morning, only to face its return by evening. One remarkable anecdote from Scandinavia describes icicles forming on indoor rafters, dripping down on unlucky sleepers below. Servants stretched cloths to catch the meltwater, a primitive but necessary fix for a problem that must have felt almost otherworldly. Imagine trying to fall asleep beneath the faint crackle of ice above, wondering if a shard might snap loose and land on your bed. Scholars still debate how widespread this phenomenon truly was. Some argue that frost inside chambers was common only in the harsher climates of northern Europe, while others suspect it may have touched households across the continent in the coldest winters. Some historians argue that even in milder climates, unheated stone chambers could drop to freezing temperatures with ease. The reality was likely a mix. Severity varied from place to place, but the risk of waking to ice inside your room was never far away. Now, place yourself in that scene. Dawn filters in, dim and gray, while your own breath hangs in the air like smoke. The bed curtains feel stiff, rimmed with frozen crystals. You reach for the wash basin, only to touch a sheet of ice instead of water. Your joints ache from the chill, and even the thought of throwing off the covers feels like punishment. The details are striking: the sting of frozen fabric against your skin, the brittle creak of wood shrunken by frost, the silence pierced only by the faint drip of melting ice. Peasant cottages faced the same trials, though in humbler ways. Frost coated the thatch and rafters, sometimes drifting down like snow in the middle of the night. Children woke with eyes tangled in their hair. Parents, with grim humor, joked about sleeping beneath the clouds indoors. Yet jokes did little to soften the reality. Frostbite, chilblains, and lung infections often followed in its wake. Even nobles, cushioned by wealth, could not entirely escape. Hot stones and furs might keep the body alive, but the air itself remained hostile. Diaries and letters revealed the mental strain. People wrote of dreading the moment they had to rise, of feeling trapped beneath blankets because the world beyond was too cruel to face. One English poet even turned it into a metaphor, describing love as a bed without frost within the hangings, a tender contrast to a bitter reality. For that poet, true intimacy meant defying the nightly chill, creating warmth where the world offered nothing but ice. It shows how deeply frost shaped not only daily life, but also imagination itself. So when you think of medieval sleep, don't forget the surreal beauty of those nights when cold etched patterns on walls and turned chambers into frozen galleries. To live in a castle was to share your room with ice, to wake each morning reminded that stone and frost stood united against your comfort. And yet people carried on. They scraped frost from the walls, piled on blankets, whispered prayers, and braced themselves for mornings that felt almost as bitter indoors as they did outside. Now, shift the scene. Imagine not being in a castle or cottage at all, but out on the road, far from the familiar safety of home. Medieval travel was slow, exhausting, and often perilous. And when darkness fell, the challenge of warmth became sharper than ever. Castles had their fireplaces and tapestries. Peasants had their family hearths. But travelers, pilgrims, merchants, wandering knights, were left to seek whatever shelter they could find. More often than not, that meant inns. But forget the romantic image of a quaint, cozy inn. The medieval inn was usually a timber hall filled with smoke, crowded rooms, and beds shared with strangers. Guests could be packed 3 or 4 to a mattress, blankets stretched thin, with privacy virtually non-existent. And yet inns offered one thing travelers desperately needed: heat. A fire blazed in the main hall, and the sheer press of bodies multiplied warmth. One weary traveler in 15th century Italy complained bitterly that the beds crawled with vermin. Yet even he admitted that, thanks to the company of fellow guests, at least he didn't freeze. Picture yourself crawling onto a straw mattress, wedged between 2 strangers, the heavy scent of ale and sweat hanging in the air. Hardly pleasant, but your toes survived the night, and that was what mattered. Sometimes the accommodations grew even stranger. A number of inns were so poorly supplied that travelers ended up sleeping in the stables. At first it sounds degrading, yet some people actually preferred it. Horses and cattle gave off steady heat, and a stable crowded with animals could feel far warmer than a drafty room upstairs. Pilgrims walking the Camino de Santiago even wrote about choosing stalls deliberately, curling against hay bales beside the livestock, their breath mingling with the animals. The smell was strong, but the warmth was undeniable. In more rural places, hospitality followed older customs. Villagers were often expected to welcome travelers, especially pilgrims or those who carried religious tokens. A peasant household might offer a spot near the hearth or space on a straw pallet. Warmth here came not from fine bedding, but from generosity and human closeness. You would fall asleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers, the crackle of a small fire nearby, the lingering aroma of stew hanging in the rafters. One curious record from a 14th century French town even describes communal inns where long wooden platforms were spread with straw, and dozens of travelers, men and women alike, lay side by side. For us, the thought of pressing against strangers might feel awkward or unsettling. But in that world, shared warmth outweighed any sense of embarrassment. Survival mattered more than privacy. Scholars still debate whether inns offered more comfort than castles. Some argue they did. Though crowded and dirty, their smaller rooms trapped warmth better than the vast, drafty chambers of nobles. Others countered that inns carried their own dangers: lice, fleas, theft. At least castles, for all their icy chill, provided security. Both perspectives hold truth. For the weary medieval traveler, survival often came down to a harsh choice: cold solitude or crowded discomfort. Now picture yourself inside one of these inns. You push open the door and step into a hall alive with noise and fire. The air is thick with the smell of ale, smoke, and roasting meat. A spot is cleared on a straw pallet, and you squeeze in among strangers. The floor creaks beneath heavy boots, dogs bark at scraps, mugs slam against tables. Yet despite the chaos, the warmth of so many bodies begins to ease the ache from your limbs. As the night deepens, the hall quiets. Snores replace laughter, and the glow of embers softens the room. You feel the press of bodies around you, the scratch of straw against thin linen, the thick scent of sweat and smoke lingering in the air. The rhythmic breathing of a dozen sleepers surrounds you. You shift carefully, trying not to disturb your neighbor, until at last the steady murmur of the inn lulls you into a shallow but necessary rest. Even nobles could not escape this reality when traveling. Royal processions required armies of attendants, and inns overflowed almost instantly. Records describe monarchs lodging in monasteries or seizing entire households to host their retinues. Yet even kings, for all their power, could not outrun the same fundamental problem: warmth was scarce, and sleep was always at the mercy of the cold. Warmth was rare, and travel stripped away layers of privilege. In the grand tapestry of medieval sleep, remember the traveler. For him, every night carried uncertainty, every bed was a gamble. Would it be a flea-ridden pallet in a smoky inn, a stable shared with horses, a spot on the floor of a stranger's cottage, or, if fortune allowed, the spare hall of a monastery? No matter the setting, the aim was always the same: to trap enough warmth to survive until morning. Every household devised strategies to endure the night, but not all succeeded. The medieval world left behind stories, half history, half legend, of people who faced nights so bitter they became warnings to future generations. To sleep in a castle was to battle an invisible enemy, and sometimes that enemy won. One chilling chronicle from the 13th century tells of guards in Flanders who froze solid at their posts during a brutal winter siege. When dawn came, their comrades found them still standing, spears in hand, their bodies hardened by ice. The writer recorded it not as tragedy, but as testimony to winter's merciless power, as though cold itself were a weapon of war. Imagine that eerie sight: men turned into statues overnight, their watch fires extinguished long before. Not all tales were so grim. Some were more intimate, almost domestic. A noblewoman from Burgundy wrote of her cousin, visiting from Italy, who shivered endlessly through one winter's night and begged for dawn, having never known such frost. He survived, of course, but the story was retold with laughter, teasing him for his weakness while quietly admitting the truth: the terror of a night that seemed as though it might never end. A haunting folk tale from Scandinavia tells of a young bride who entered her husband's castle, only to collapse the moment she felt the biting chill of her new chamber. The villagers whispered that she had fallen victim to a curse cast by the icy spirits of the north. Whether her fate came from illness or simply the merciless cold, the story endured as a warning across generations. Even the bonds of noble marriage could be tested by stone walls and winter winds that no wealth could soften. Historians still debate how literally such tales should be taken. Were they embellished into legend, turning ordinary hardship into something dramatic? Or do they preserve the memory of real tragedies, frostbite and hypothermia claiming lives in a world with no insulation or modern comforts? Some scholars argue that chroniclers inflated these stories to deliver moral lessons, while others believe they were genuine records of a climate far more brutal than ours today. Now picture yourself seated in a vast, dimly lit hall. The fire in the hearth flickers low, shadows stretching across the stone walls, while an old retainer begins his tale. He speaks of a knight who died in his sleep, trusting too few blankets to guard him against the cold. Wide-eyed children huddle closer to their cloaks, shivering as they listened. These stories were more than just entertainment. They carried a clear warning: take the cold seriously, or the cold will take you. Even accounts written by travelers echoed this same grim caution. Pilgrims described companions who never made it across mountain passes, their frozen bodies discovered in the thaw of spring, curled as if still dreaming. Soldiers on winter campaigns wrote of comrades who failed to rise from their bedrolls, their cloaks frozen stiff with frost. In such conditions, the boundary between peaceful sleep and silent death was frighteningly thin. The very details of these nights remain chilling, even centuries later. The sting of frost biting against bare skin. The slow, merciless numbness creeping into fingers and toes. The terrible fear of closing your eyes, unsure if they would ever open again. To lie down in a chamber gripped by freezing air was always a gamble. Blankets, fires, and whispered prayers were the wagers. The prize, if fortune allowed, was survival. Yet, alongside the grim tales of loss, there were also stories of endurance and triumph. Peasants told with pride how their families weathered long winters in cottages no larger than a single room, where warmth came not from wealth but from the closeness of bodies gathered around the fire. Nobles, on the other hand, boasted of midwinter hunts and feasts, lavish displays meant to prove that their fortunes had subdued the season itself. For every sorrowful account of death, there were voices celebrating survival, framing endurance through the winter as a victory in its own right. Perhaps that is why legends of knights frozen in their sleep held such power. They reminded listeners that castles, for all their might, were no more resistant to the cold than the simplest of huts. Stone walls might repel armies, but they could never bar winter's breath. In those long, dark hours, even the most powerful lord relied on blankets, burning logs, and the warmth of human company, just as the poorest farmer did. So when you imagine the act of sleep in the Middle Ages, you must hold both truths together. There were those who succumbed to the frost, their stories told as warnings, and those who endured, their quiet survival remembered as triumph. Each tale carried its own lesson: respect the night, guard against the cold, and never assume that waking was promised. And always, the medieval sleeper returned to the hearth. The fire was more than a tool, it was the soul of the household. It stood as the thin boundary between life and death on the harshest of winter nights. Its globe painted shadows on the walls, shadows that swayed and flickered like watchful guardians, rising and falling with the flames themselves. To sleep in a castle was to live in constant conversation with fire. It was something to fear, something to crave, and something you could not hope to survive without. The hearth dominated every sense. The crack of oak logs echoed through the chamber like a steady heartbeat. Sparks shot upward in sudden bursts, tracing glowing trails before fading into the darkness of the chimney. The sharp, resinous scent of burning wood clung to walls, clothes, and hair. Heat radiated unevenly, scorching your face while your back remained chilled. The hearth was a paradox, both protector and tormentor, a giver of life and a smoky tyrant that demanded constant attention. For nobles, fire was more than warmth, it was a declaration of status. A roaring blaze meant wealth, proof that you had the resources and servants to gather endless fuel, to strip forests if necessary, to keep flames alive through the night. In some castles, there were even servants whose only responsibility was to guard the hearth and ensure no ember ever died. Allowing the fire to go out was not just inconvenient, it was considered a mark of shame. Yet in the poorest homes, the fire held the same sacred importance. Families huddled on earthen floors beside their small, rough hearths, livestock sometimes sharing the warmth. They sat close together, laughing, praying, trading stories, and passing bowls of thick stew while watching flames dance across simple logs. Their fires lacked the grandeur of carved stone mantels, but the comfort they provided was just as genuine, perhaps even more so. In both the soaring halls of castles and the cramped cottages of peasants, fire pulled people together. It offered not only the possibility of sleep but also the sense of being safe, however briefly, against the winter night. One traveler in Germany even recorded how villagers would gather before bed in a circle around the hearth, stretching out their hands and whispering blessings to the flames, as if the fire itself were something holy. They believed the fire carried their hopes into the darkness, guarding their rest until morning. It shows how practical necessity often blurred into ritual. Fire was more than a source of warmth, it was spirit, memory, and faith all at once. Historians still debate how much of this reverence was grounded in survival and how much was symbolic belief. Some argue it was nothing more than instinct, survival wrapped in tradition. Others suggest that fire truly held a spiritual dimension, woven into prayer, myth, and the very framework of daily life. The truth may be both. For people who lived so close to danger, fire could never remain a simple tool, it became a bearer of meaning. Now, return in your imagination to the castle chamber one final time. The bed curtains are drawn tight, heavy blankets layered high. Beyond the walls, the wind lashes against the towers, and snow hisses angrily against the shutters. The night presses down with all its weight. Yet within the hearth, the embers glow faintly, sending thin threads of light through the gaps in the curtains. You close your eyes to the low sigh of flames, comforted by the knowledge that this fragile glow is all that stands between you and the frost. Every sense is engaged. The taste of smoke still lingers faintly on your tongue. The heavy press of wool and fur rests across your chest. At your feet, a dog curls tightly, its warmth a silent gift. A whispered prayer echoes in your thoughts as you surrender to sleep. In the Middle Ages, rest was never effortless, never guaranteed. It was won through constant effort, through rituals, tricks, and every fragment of warmth people could gather. Castles, for all their stone and strength, were fortresses against men but never against winter. What truly preserved life in those long nights was not walls or weapons, but resilience, resourcefulness, and the shared strength of community. To endure the night meant piling on blankets, sharing body heat, feeding the fire, and clinging tightly to hope. Against the unending cold of the medieval night, humanity itself became the truest flame. Now let the pace ease. Picture the embers glowing faintly, not fierce, but tender, like weary coals resting after long labor. The chamber grows hushed, the wind beyond the walls fading into a distant murmur. The blankets press down with steady weight, protective and grounding, anchoring you into the mattress. The struggles of the cold, the watchfulness of fires, the restless sounds of dogs and servants, all of it begins to fall away, as if you had drawn a curtain across the world. Your breath deepens. Each inhale carries the faint taste of smoke and wool. Each exhale drifts slowly into stillness. The noises that once filled these halls, boots striking stone, shutters clattering, monks chanting in the distance, are reduced now to softened echoes, no more than whispers in memory. Even the castle itself seems to slumber, its ancient stones holding silence like a vow. Picture yourself safe in your cocoon. At your feet, the dog shifts with a sigh, curling closer. The final candle flickers, then dies, and darkness folds around you like another layer of warmth. The cold lingers, yes, but you no longer resist it. Instead, you yield to it, just as countless sleepers before you did, accepting that sleep itself is a fragile truce with the night. Your body grows heavier. Thoughts dissolve into drifting shapes and colors. The medieval world, with its smoke, its frost, and its struggles, begins to retreat, like ice melting in the touch of sunlight. What remains is peace. You are warm enough. You are safe enough. You are tired enough. And so the story closes. The hearth glows faintly, the bed cradles you, and the long night carries you gently into dreams. Rest now, as they once did, wrapped in quiet resilience. Sweet dreams.